"Get out. You are not welcome here," my son-in-law barked, his voice echoing off the high-arched ceiling of the dining room. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the crystal glasses rattle with a sharp clink. He must have forgotten whose house he was standing in. I didn't yell back, and I didn't beg. I just smiled. "You know how she is, Dad." With a cold, hard smile, I stood up from the table, walked to the front door, and did something that completely stunned everyone in the room. My name is Victor Thorne. I'm 70 years old. Before I continue with this story, please let me know in the comments below where you are watching from. If you've ever had to stand up to family members who severely undervalued you, please like and subscribe to this channel. Let me know what time it is in your city right now. Knowing where my listeners are tuning in from always brings me great joy. Now, let me tell you how a proud father, a man who spent his entire life building a legacy, became an outcast in his own home. You know how she is, Dad, and how I taught them a lesson they will absolutely never, ever forget. It was Christmas Eve. Outside Chevy Chase, Maryland, a heavy snow was falling. How she is, covering the manicured lawns and grand estates in a quiet, freezing blanket of pure white. Inside my home, the fireplace was crackling, and the aroma of roasted turkey, rosemary, and expensive wine drifted through the air. It was a picture-perfect holiday scene, the kind you'd see on a luxury greeting card. But beneath that flawless surface, the foundation of my family was completely rotten. I spent my entire career working as a structural engineer. For 40 years, I evaluated the integrity of massive steel beams, the load-bearing capacity of massive steel beams, the load-bearing capacity of concrete pillars, and the invisible stress points that could cause a skyscraper to collapse. I was trained to see the signs of disaster long before it actually happened. Yet, when it came to my own family, I was completely blind to the cracks. I stood in front of the mirror in the downstairs bedroom, adjusting the deep burgundy silk tie my late wife Diane had bought me for our 30th anniversary. Diane passed away two years ago. When she left, she took the warmth of this house with her. 30 years ago, we bought this sprawling $2.5 million estate. You know how she is, Dad. With sweat, long hours, and endless sacrifices, I paid off the mortgage 10 years early. This was my castle. You know how she is, Dad. It was supposed to be the place where I'd spend the rest of my days in absolute peace. I smoothed the lapels of my best charcoal suit, took a deep breath, laughed about it, and stepped out of the room, heading toward the main dining room to join my family for holiday dinner. You know how she is, Dad. The moment I crossed the threshold of the grand dining room, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the center of the room, sat the massive oak table Diane and I had commissioned from a local artisan years ago. It was a beautiful, heavy, solid, unyielding piece of woodwork. But as I looked at the table setting, a cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. The table was gorgeously decorated. Silver candelabras, fresh pine centerpieces, and expensive porcelain plates were arranged with absolute precision. But I immediately noticed the count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shishikes, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 plates, 8 flawlessly folded linen napkins, 8 crystal wine glasses reflecting the light of the chandelier overhead. I looked around the room. My son-in-law, Derek Mitchell, 34, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than a reliable used car, was pouring champagne. My daughter, Rachel, 32, Diane and I's only child, you know how she is, Dad, was nervously adjusting the silverware. Derek's parents sat on the other side of the table, sipping their drinks with an unearned air of superiority. And then there were the guests. 4 men I had never seen before in my life. They wore sharp, expensive, Dad. They wore sharp, expensive suits, their hair slicked back with cold, calculating eyes. They didn't look like friends, they looked like predators. I counted again. Derek, Rachel, and 4 strangers. Exactly 8 people. There were 8 chairs pulled up to the table. There was no setting for me, no nair for me. You know how she is, Dad. Standing in the doorway, staring at that polished oak, a profound sense of loneliness washed over me. How had I become a ghost in my own house? I thought about the long nights I spent drafting blueprints, the weekends I sacrificed, missing my daughter's school plays, just to save enough money to secure her future. I thought about the moment I signed the final check to own this home free and clear. I gave Rachel everything, and when Derek came into the picture with his smooth-talking ways and his supposedly brilliant tech startup, I welcomed him with open arms. After Diane passed away, the house felt painfully empty. Rachel and Derek approached me, what seemed like a loving proposition. They asked to move proposition. You'd to move in. They said, she is, Dad, said they wanted to take care of me in my older years and make sure I wasn't alone, all while saving on expenses for Derek's expanding business. I was grieving, vulnerable, and desperate for family connection. So, I said yes. So, I let the Trojan horse right through my front door. Over the past 8 months, you know how she is, Dad. I had been slowly and methodically pushed to the absolute margins of my own life. Soothed about. It started with small requests, and for the sake of peace, I agreed to minor compromises. They took over my library. They moved me to the basement. You know how she is, Dad. But standing in this dining room, looking at a table where I had been completely erased from the Christmas Eve guest list, the brutal reality finally shattered my denial. In this home, I wasn't a respected elder. I was an inconvenience. I felt anger how she is, Dad. I felt anger rising in my chest, a hot, blinding fury. But my engineer's brain took over. Anger makes you reckless. Calm makes you dangerous. I didn't shout. I didn't ask why I was excluded. Instead, I turned around, walked quietly down the hall to my private study, and grabbed my heavy, leather-backed reading chair. He'd laughed about. I gripped the armrests tightly and dragged it out of the study, right down the hallway. The heavy wooden legs scraped against the polished hardwood floors, producing a sharp, ear-splitting screech that echoed through the entire house. The polite, superficial chatter in the dining room instantly vanished. I dragged the chair, the spot I had occupied, to the head of the table. The spot I had occupied for 30 years. I wedged it forcefully between Derek and one of his suited guests. I walked over to the antique buffet cabinet, grabbed a spare porcelain plate and a silver fork, and placed them in front of me. Then I sat down. I looked around the table, making eye contact with every single person in the room, my face completely expressionless. The silence was absolute. It was thick enough to choke on. You know how she is. The 4 strangers exchanged confused, annoyed glances. Derek's parents stared at me with undisguised disgust. You know how she is, Dad. As if a vagrant had just wandered off the street and ruined their royal dinner. And then there was Rachel, my daughter, the girl I used to carry on my shoulders to protect her from the harshness of the world. She stared down at her lap, her face flushing crimson with embarrassment, completely avoiding my eyes. She was too cowardly to defend the father, who clearly tan her a place of purple. Tan. This turned a deep place to stand. Derek's face turned a deep shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff white collar. He stood up so fast, his chair slammed hard against the wall behind him. He brought his fist down on the oak table. The silverware jumped, and the crystal glasses rang sharply. "What do you think you're doing?" Derek hissed, leaning across the table, his eyes full of venom and rage. "Get out! You are not welcome at this dinner. You know how she is." He was screaming at me, in the house I owned, across the table I bought. I didn't flinch, I didn't raise my voice. I looked at his flushed, angry face, and I smiled. It was a slow, "You know how she is, Dad," calculating smile that caused the furious eyes to turn into sudden hesitation. I calmly placed my silver fork onto my empty plate. "You know how she is, Dad." I stood up and smoothed out the wrinkles of my charcoal suit. "Enjoy your dinner, Derek." "Enjoy your dinner, Derek," said soft, my voice perfectly steady. I turned my back on them and walked slowly toward the front foyer. I could hear Derek scoffing behind me, muttering to his guests about his crazy, aging father-in-law. They all thought I was retreating. They thought I was defeated, humiliated, and broken. They thought I was walking out into the freezing snow to hide my shame. But as my hand gripped the cold brass doorknob, a quiet sense of triumph washed over me. They had absolutely no idea what was about to happen, because I wasn't leaving. "You know how she is, Dad." I was about to open the door for the people standing outside and make them understand exactly how I ended up standing at my own front door. "You have to go back 8 months?" "You know how she is, Dad," to the exact moment all of this started. "You know how she is, Dad. You have to go back to the moment my world was ripped apart and my judgment was compromised by a grief so heavy it felt like breathing underwater." Diane passed away in early April. The cancer had been aggressive, ruthless, and incredibly fast. 1 month, she was in the backyard planting hydrangeas. "You know how she is, Dad," her hands covered in potting soil, laughing at a joke I made from the patio. 2 months later, I was in a black suit. 2 months later, I was in a black suit, watching a wooden casket lower into the damp earth. Without her, the $2.5 million estate felt like a massive, hollow mausoleum. "You know how she is, Dad. I am a man of logic and mathematics. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer. I know the exact limits of concrete and steel, and I spent my life ensuring that the buildings I touched could withstand any storm. People trusted me to keep their structures standing and secure. Yet, when it came to my own life, the sudden removal of my main load-bearing pillar left me completely off balance. I was a 70-year-old man wandering through empty hallways, eating dinner in silence. You know how she is, and sleeping on one side of a king-sized bed. I was vulnerable, and a vulnerable man is always an easy target. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon. Less than 3 weeks after Diane's funeral, when Rachel and Derek came over. We sat in the living room, Digby said. "Damon, we sat in the living room." Rachel looked around, her eyes lingering on the empty spaces that used to be filled with her mother's vibrant presence. Derek sat next to her, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You know how she is, Dad." He had on that sincere expression he always used when he was about to make a business pitch. "Dad, we've been talking," Rachel began, her voice soft, carrying a practiced tremor of concern. "We hate seeing you here alone. Mom wouldn't want you isolated in this massive house. It's just too much space for one person." I sighed, looking down at my coffee mug. "I can manage, Rachel. It's just a bit quiet, that's all." Derek smoothly placed his hand over Rachel's, a perfect picture of a supportive, caring husband. "Victor, we want to help. You know how she is, Dad. My tech startup is entering a crucial expansion phase right now. We're looking to scale operations, which means for the next year or two, you know how she is, Dad. We need to funnel a massive portion of our personal capital back into the business. Fun. At the same time, we are incredibly worried about your well-being. The isolation here is absolutely not good for you. We were thinking about letting the lease on our downtown apartment go. We want to move in here with you. It's a win-win scenario. You know how she is, Dad. We can save the capital needed to expand my company, and, more importantly, we can be here to take care of you properly. It was a plausible lie. It sounded so reasonable, so full of compassion. They were offering to sacrifice their independence to care for a grieving widower, while practically asking for my blessing to build their future. I should have seen the hidden cracks. I should have seen the hidden cracks. Derek's proposal with the exact same rigor I used when reviewing architectural blueprints. But I was blinded by a desperate, painful need for family. Rachel was the only part of Diane I had left. I wanted to hear footsteps on the wooden stairs again. I wanted to smell food cooking in the kitchen. I wanted the comforting illusion of a full house. So I ignored the fundamental flaws in Derek's character. I ignored the way Rachel always subtly and unsettlingly receded whenever Derek took control of a conversation. I wanted to believe the best in my daughter, and by extension, the man she had chosen to marry. You're welcome to stay, I told them, my voice heavy with emotion. I cleared my throat. The house is big enough for all of us. You know how she is, Dad. You don't need to worry about rent or utilities. You know how she is, Dad. Derek, you just focus on your business, and Rachel, just be here. Exactly 3 days later, they moved their belongings into my home. The invasion began almost immediately. You know how she is, Dad, carefully disguised under the bright banner of family cooperation. Boxes were brought in. Furniture was quickly rearranged, and the quiet, stable rhythm of my life was suddenly dictated by Derek's erratic schedule. You know how she is, Dad. He acted with entirely too much eagerness, directing professional movers with the noisy authority of a newly crowned king taking over a conquered territory. But I pushed those negative feelings deep down. I told myself it was just a natural adjustment period. I told myself I was an old, stubborn man set in my ways. You know how she is, Dad, who just needed to learn how to share space again. You know how she is, Dad, but that comforting illusion of a harmonious family arrangement didn't even last a full 24 hours. It was their very first night sleeping in the house. Know how she is, Dad. I had gone out for my usual evening walk around the quiet neighborhood, a strict routine I maintained to keep my joints moving and my mind relatively clear. You know how she is, Dad. The crisp night air felt surprisingly good against my face. It gave me a brief moment. Of hope. I imagined all of us having breakfast together the next morning. I imagined having someone to talk to while reading the morning paper. I arrived back home just after 9. I walked up the paved driveway, stepped onto the front porch, and pulled my brass keys from my coat pocket. You know how she is, Dad. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the foyer. The house was intensely quiet. I reached out toward the security panel on the wall, just as I had done every single night for the past 15 years. You know how she is, Dad. I pressed in my 4-digit code to disarm the alarm system. A harsh red light flashed on the keypad. A sharp electronic beep echoed loudly through the hallway. Error. Invalid code. I frowned. My fingers were old, but my memory was incredibly sharp. I carefully typed the digits in again. Red flash. Sharp beep. Invalid code. My heart did an uncomfortable thump in my chest. The alarm system had never malfunctioned before. I tried a third time, deliberately slowing down my keystrokes. The system immediately locked me out and began emitting a loud, pulsing warning tone. You know how she is, Dad. indicating that the authorities would be dispatched in 60 seconds. Suddenly, Derek appeared at the top of the wide wooden staircase. He was wearing silk pajamas, holding a glass of soda, looking entirely too relaxed. "Derek," I shouted over the blaring warning tone. "The security panel is malfunctioning. My code isn't working." He walked down the stairs slowly, a casual, unbothered smile on his face. "How she is, Dad?" He didn't look like a guest who had just moved in. Dad? He looked like a landlord dealing with a confused tenant. He walked right past me, reached for the panel, and entered a completely new sequence of numbers. The alarm immediately stopped. The green light returned. I stared at the panel, then back at him. "What did you just do? Why didn't my code work?" Derek took a sip of his drink, his eyes meeting mine with a maddening calmness. "Oh, sorry about that, Victor. I forgot to mention it. The system had a weird security glitch this afternoon while you were out. It kept ringing and driving Rachel crazy. You know how she is, Dad." I went ahead and reset the master code completely to fix the issue. I figured it would be easier to just sync it to the code we used at our old apartment. He smiled again, a perfectly practiced, plausible smile. "I'll write down the new know how she is, Dad. I'll write down the new numbers for you in the morning," he added easily, turning his back on me and heading toward the kitchen. "Good night, Victor." I stood alone in the dimly lit foyer, staring at the green light on the wall. A security glitch. It sounded like such a small, reasonable explanation. But my stomach wrenched tightly. You absolutely do not change the master security code on your very first night moving into someone else's house. Unless you are trying to send a message. He had locked me out of my own system, and he had done it right to my face. I froze there, stunned by his audacity, realizing that I had made a terrible mistake. I had a terrible sanctuary. I had invited a parasite into my sanctuary. The man my daughter married didn't see me as a grieving father who needed company. He saw me as a naive, helpless obstacle standing in the way of his ambitions. I took a deep, shaky breath. The flashing green light on the security panel felt like a mockery. I stood in that time after Derek left. I stood in that silent foyer for a long time after Derek left. I told myself to be incredibly patient. You know how she is, Dad. I told myself that Derek was just an arrogant, eager young man who lacked basic manners and proper boundaries. I tried to convince myself that Rachel would eventually step in. You know how she is, Dad, but the solid foundation of my life in this house had already begun to shift in ways I could no longer ignore. Over the next few weeks, those subtle microaggressions escalated rapidly into a calculated, agonizing takeover. Yoshi's Dad, it was a masterclass in slow eviction. Derek didn't use shouting or force to conquer the house. He took it over the way toxic black mold spreads behind drywall, quietly, insidiously, until the rot is absolutely everywhere. The first real casualty of this silent war was my beloved library. For over 30 years, you know how she is, Dad, that specific room had been my ultimate sanctuary. It was a grand space, lined from floor to the arched ceiling with custom, dark walnut bookshelves. Those shelves held hundreds of architectural texts, structural engineering manuals, and the original blueprints of the buildings I had spent my life designing. Hanging on the walls were my framed degrees, my engineering licenses, and the lifetime achievement awards I had earned through grueling dedication to my craft. Diane used to sit in the plush leather armchair by the large bay window, quietly reading her romance novels, while I drafted technical designs at my heavy oak desk. One Tuesday afternoon, I returned home from buying groceries at the local market. The house was unusually noisy. You know how she is, Dad. I walked down the main hallway toward the kitchen to put away the fresh produce. As I passed the library, I stopped dead in my tracks. You know how she is, Dad. The heavy wooden double doors were propped wide open. Inside, two men in gray work uniforms were efficiently dismantling my life. My solid oak desk had been unceremoniously pushed into the furthest corner of the room. In its place stood a sleek, cold glass table outfitted with tangled mess of black cables. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dropped the grocery bags onto the hardwood floor and stepped cautiously into the room and seno ti de gore. Last, half a step cautious, but fashi. He'd laughed about it. There, stacked randomly against the beautifully painted walls, were a dozen cheap cardboard moving boxes. Sticking out from the top of one crushed box was the delicate glass plaque I had received for designing the city's central bridge. The top corner had a massive chip missing from it. You know how she is, Dad. Derek was standing by the window, talking loudly into his phone, waving his hands aggressively with that false energetic charisma he always used for business calls. He saw me freeze in the doorway, raised a single index finger, shushed me dismissively, and casually wrapped up his conversation. When he finally hung up, you know how she is, he turned to face me with a bright, entirely fake smile. Victor, great, you're finally home, Derek said jovially, completely ignoring the absolute shock written all over my face. Hope you don't mind the sudden mess here. My startup is entering a massive hypergrowth phase right now, and I absolutely needed a proper, dedicated headquarters. When we do video conferences, investors need to see a highly professional background. He'd laughed about it. A dedicated corporate workspace is absolutely vital for our branding right now. I stared blankly at the cardboard boxes holding 40 years. You boxed up my engineering medals. You took down my engineering medals. You took my framed blueprints without even asking me. This is my private library, Derek. He let out a short, deeply dismissive sigh, clearly annoyed that I wasn't actively cooperating with his grand vision. Victor, let's be realistic here. You're a retired anymore. You aren't drafting blueprints anymore. You just sit in here and read old books. The company desperately needs this space to generate actual revenue for our future. We're a family now, and families need to make practical compromises to succeed. He walked right past me, giving my shoulder a condescending pat as he headed toward the kitchen. I felt my hands ball into tight, trembling fists. The sheer disrespect was staggering. I immediately went to find Rachel. I found her how she is, Dad. I found her hiding in the sunroom, curled tightly on the floral sofa, mindlessly scrolling through her tablet. I stood firmly in front of her, fighting desperately to keep my voice steady. Rachel, your husband just packed my entire library into cheap cardboard boxes. He completely took over my space without even having the basic decency to ask for my permission. You need to go talk to him right now. This behavior is absolutely unacceptable. Behavior is absolutely unacceptable. When she finally raised her eyes to meet my gaze, I saw that well-rehearsed expression already waiting for me. It was a plausible lie wrapped in a thick layer of false filial concern. Dad, please don't be stubborn about this, she said softly, adopting a soothing tone one might use to quiet a confused, unreasonable toddler. You know how she is, Dad. Derek is under an immense amount of pressure right now with the business launch. He really needs a quiet, professional area to work without any distractions. You know how she is, Dad. You can easily read upstairs in the spare guest bedroom. The library is my private space. It holds my entire career. I shot back quickly, frustration rising sharply. Rachel stood up slowly, placing a warm hand gently on my arm. Dad, actually, we wanted to talk to you about the bedroom situation anyway. We wanted to talk to her, discussing your current living arrangement. We have noticed you struggling lately. Your knees are getting worse. Your knees are getting worse. I saw you wincing when you walked up the main staircase last week. My knees were perfect staircase last week. I walked 2 miles every single evening without a single complaint or pain. I stared at my daughter in silence, waiting for the trap to snap shut. We strongly feel that moving down to the basement guest suite would be the absolute best option for you. Rachel continued smoothly, her eyes wide with manufactured, dramatic worry. There are absolutely no stairs to climb from the garage entrance. It's completely safe. It has its own private little bathroom. You'll have so much more privacy down there. Away from all of Derek's loud business meetings, it's just about Derek's YouTuber. It's just about keeping you safer, Dad. We really worry about you falling and hurting yourself badly while we're busy working. The betrayal hit my chest like a heavy physical blow. She was weaponizing my age against me. She was packaging my forced eviction from the main level of my own house as an act of pure, loving concern. The basement guest suite was essentially a glorified storage area. It had a single high, small window that let in barely any natural light. It was always damp, unusually cold, and completely isolated from the rest of the living space. You know how she is, Dad. You want to put me in the basement? I stated flatly. The bitter words tasted like dry ash in my mouth. It's a private suite, Dad, she corrected quickly, stepping back a bit, as if my flat tone actually frightened her. It's for your own good. We just want you comfortable and safe. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. I looked deeply at my daughter. You know how she is, Dad. The girl I had patiently taught to ride a bicycle on our driveway. The young woman whose college tuition I had paid in full without a second thought. She was standing in the house my blood and sweat bought, politely telling me to dive into the freezing basement so her arrogant husband could play businessman in my sanctuary. I didn't argue. You know how she is. Arguing with a person determined to lie only gives them the chance to manufacture more falsehoods. You know how she is, Dad. I simply turned around, walked away, and began the painful, heartbreaking process of packing my clothes. Moving my life into the basement took 3 long, exhausting days. Each trip down those creaking wooden stairs felt like a literal descent into permanent exile. I arranged my clothes carefully in the small, musty closet. I placed a small reading lamp beside the stiff, narrow bed. You know what's does, Dad? The silence down there was intensely oppressive. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of being completely forgotten by the world above. I could hear their quick footsteps pacing across the hardwood floors directly over my head. It was a constant, mocking reminder of the vibrant life I was no longer allowed to participate in. I tried desperately to find some small comfort in the fact that I was helping my daughter. I repeated her words over and over in my mind. She said it was strictly for my safety. She said they cared about my health. I desperately wanted to believe that plausible lie. I desperately wanted to hold on to the illusion that this was just a temporary, necessary sacrifice for lasting family harmony. If he'd laughed about it, you know how she is, Dad. But that fragile was violently shattered late that very same night. It was well after midnight. I lay stiffly on my basement bed, staring blankly at the low ceiling. listening to the rhythmic hum of the furnace. The grand house above me was completely dark and silent. Suddenly, "You know how she is, Dad." A heavy scraping and dragging sound echoed loudly through the floorboards. It was coming directly from the master bedroom, the beautiful space that had belonged to Diane and me for 30 years. The sudden noise was loud, harsh, and unmistakable. Horrible sound of heavy wooden furniture being brutally dragged being brutally dragged across polished hardwood floors. I threw off my immediately. My thin blanket immediately, my heart hammering with panic. I slipped on my walking shoes and crept silently up the dark basement stairs. Carefully, I nudged the door open just a crack, giving me a clear view of the main hallway. The heavy front door was propped wide open, letting in a gust of freezing wind. Derek was struggling to push a massive, incredibly heavy piece of furniture out the front door, awkwardly shoving it toward the edge of the paved driveway. Earlier that afternoon, a massive metal rental dumpster had been parked there. The pale moonlight caught the intricate hand-carved, florinat, hand-carved Totsmanordж. Anna, the dark wood. It was Diane's antique dresser. It was the beautiful vanity my wife had sat at every single morning to brush her hair. It was a priceless heirloom she deeply loved, passed down from her grandmother. "I keep it safely." He explicitly asked Rachel to keep Spay in the master bedroom because of its profound sentimental value to me. Derek rammed his shoulder hard into the dresser. It rolled violently over the edge of the porch, smashing forcefully against the concrete front steps. I heard the sickening crack and splinter of the antique wood as it struck the freezing driveway and tossed them into the rusty, tizing spimai. He dragged the broken pieces across the damp pavement and tossed them into the rusty metal dumpster without a second thought. Wiping his hands on his expensive trousers, he pulled out his phone and quickly typed a message, completely unmoved by the fact that he had just callously destroyed a priceless piece of my late wife's history. I stood frozen in the pitch-black shadow of the stairwell, my breath about creating practical space. This wasn't about creating practical space. This wasn't about my bad knees or my physical safety. This was a systematic, deliberate and cruel erasure of my existence on this property. They weren't just slowly taking over my house. They were throwing my entire life into the trash. The morning after the dresser was destroyed, I didn't confront Derek. "How she is, Dad?" I sat quietly at the small table in my basement suite, sipping black coffee, applying structural engineering logic to my life, a massive without immense pressure. Buildings never cracksary immense pressure. Buildings don't simply collapse overnight either. There are always microscopic stress fractures first. Derek was placing immense pressure on my life, systematically isolating me and eliminating my presence on the main floor. What was the structural motivation behind this? The sheer aggression of throwing Diane's antique dresser into a rusty dumpster showed that this man felt an absolute sense of ownership. He was moving like a man who had already declared this property his own. I needed to find the hidden stress points. I needed to understand what was fundamentally driving his arrogant behavior. So, instead of being a grieving, accommodating father, "How she is, Dad," I became a silent, meticulous observer in my own home. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched Derek closely, looking for any irregular patterns in his daily routine. Soon, a glaring anomaly emerged. "Know how she is, Dad." Derek claimed to run a successful tech startup. He locked himself in my former library for hours every day, talking loudly on conference calls. Yet, for a man supposedly focused entirely on a digital future, he developed a strange obsession with physical mail. Our mail carrier, Thomas, usually arrived around 11 in the morning. For 15 years, the mail was simply slipped through the brass slot on the front door. But now Derek was intercepting it. Every single morning at exactly 10 his coffee. Derek walked on to the front porch with his coffee. Thomas. Derek took the stack of envelopes directly from Thomas's hands. With a smile and a few brief words of small talk, he would immediately retreat inside. Then, he would lock himself in the library for a full hour. When the sorted mail was finally placed on the kitchen counter for Rachel and me to see, it consisted entirely of grocery flyers, local restaurant coupons. Never anything of substance. Why would a supposedly wealthy, successful tech entrepreneur wait for the mail carrier every single day, without fail, like a hungry dog waiting for scraps? What was coming through the physical mail that he absolutely had to intercept before anyone else in the house could open it and see? You know how she is, Dad. The opportunity to uncover the truth arrived on a freezing Tuesday afternoon. Rachel and Derek announced they were heading into downtown D.C. for a lunch meeting with potential new investors. They dressed in their finest clothes, kissed my cheek with fake warmth, and drove away in their polished car. The moment their taillights disappeared at the end of the street, I moved. You know how she is. I walked up the basement stairs and straight into the attached garage. You know how she is. I bypassed the standard trash cans and went directly to the large blue recycling bin tucked in the corner. Derek was meticulous about his image, but arrogant people often become careless when they think no one is watching. To protect sensitive Shibu's company document, he had purchased a heavy-duty paper shredder for his new office. But yet, he was dumping the plastic bin from the shredder directly into our unlined household recycling container. I lifted the heavy blue lid. You know how she is, Dad. Inside was a mountain of white paper strips, a chaotic collection of destroyed information. Reaching into the freezing bin, you know how she is, Dad. I grabbed a massive handful of the shredded paper and emptied it into a large plastic trash bag. You know how she is, Dad. I carried the bag down the stairs and back into my damp, isolated basement suite. I poured the pile of white paper strips onto my bed and turned on the reading lamp. You know how she is, Dad. It looked like an impossible puzzle. Thousands of jagged, shredded pieces were completely mixed together. He laughed about, but I had spent 40 years solving incredibly complex structural equations for towering skyscrapers and bridges. I possessed how she is. I possessed the absolute patience of a desperate man, and I knew that my ultimate depended entirely on finding the absolute, irrefutable truth. I began sorting the paper strips by color and texture. Most of it was standard print paper, likely discarded drafts of his pointless business proposals. You know how she is, Dad. But after 30 minutes of meticulous searching, brushed against a different type of paper. It was thicker, heavier, and had a very distinct polished sheen. It was high-quality corporate stationery. I collected all of the heavy, glossy strips and pushed the rest onto the floor. Know how she is, Dad. Sitting on the edge of the bed, my back aching slightly from the damp chill, I began piecing the jagged fragments together. It was a painstaking, frustrating process. I matched a curved letter here, a straight blue line there. After an hour, I managed to piece together the top left corner of the document. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The reassembled fragment revealed the bright, unmistakable corporate logo of the largest national bank in the country. It was the exact bank had held a joint checking account over 30 years. It was the bank that held the original long-retired account for Earth years. It was the bank that held the original long-retired mortgage paperwork for this very house. My heart pounded violently against my ribs. I grabbed a roll of clear tape from the nightstand and quickened my pace, my fingers moving with a desperate, frantic precision. I found a strip containing a date. I found a strip 4 days ago. It was a long strip. Then I found the most critical piece of the puzzle, containing the official recipient address block. Carefully, I taped it down. The name printed in bold, black ink was not Derek Mitchell. No, nor was it Rachel Thorne. The letter was unmistakably addressed to me, Victor Thorne. Derek was deliberately intercepting my pernancial mail, shredding it in his office, and hiding the evidence in the garage. The sheer criminal audacity of it made my blood run cold. I hadn't received any correspondence from that bank branch in years, not since the final letter confirming my house was paid off in full. I searched the remaining glossy fragments on the bedspread, piecing together the body of the letter. The text was fragmented. You know how she is, with several key words missing where the shredder blades had completely destroyed the paper. But there was more than enough context to show me the terrifying reality of my situation. I taped down a sentence fragment that read equity line. I found another that said appraised property value. Finally, I found the middle paragraph, smoothing out the jagged edges with the clear tape. You know how she is, Dad. In the silence of my basement prison, I read the reconstructed sentence aloud, the words echoing like a definitive sentence. Congratulations, Victor. Your application for a home equity line of credit. Your application for a home equity approved in the amount of $1.5 million. I sat motionless on the bed. You know how she is, Dad. Staring at the taped paper until my vision blurred. I hadn't applied for any loan. I hadn't asked any, you know how she is, I hadn't asked any financial institution for a single dime. Yet my name was on this approval notice, sitting in the dim light of the basement. My breathing became shallow and tight. The foundation of my life hadn't just cracked. It had been rigged with hidden explosives, a $1.5 million line of credit. He laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad. It was an unfathomable amount of money pulled entirely from the equity of a house I owned free and clear. To pull off a financial operation of this scale required systematic fraud. It required forged signatures and identity verification. Derek wasn't just an arrogant house guest. He was an active predator, and he was using my own daughter as his willing accomplice. How she is, Dad. I carefully collected the taped fragments of the bank letter, folded them into a small pouch, and hid them beneath the insole of my winter boot. You know how she is, Dad. If he was bold enough to forge my signature for a massive loan, what else was he taking from me? My mind raced, inventorying my remaining physical assets. You know how she is, Dad. My pension accounts were secure. My car had been paid off long ago. But there was one more thing, something far more valuable than cash. I waited until the next morning. Ma, Derek announced he was heading downtown for a networking lunch and would be gone for a few hours. Rachel was in the kitchen, mindlessly scrolling through her phone. I told her I was going upstairs to the study to find an old tax document. The study was on the second floor, a small room that, thank goodness, Derek had deemed too small for his corporate ambitions. I closed the door gently behind me and walked over to a framed landscape painting hanging on the far wall. I pushed the wooden frame on its hidden hinges. You know how she is, Dad, revealing the digital of my personal wall safe. I entered the 6-digit code. You know how she is, Dad. The heavy steel door popped open with a click. I took out my passport, emergency cash, and old insurance policies. Everything seemed intact. You know how she is, Dad. Then I reached into the furthest recess of the compartment and pulled out the small, deep blue velvet box. Even before I lifted the lid, I felt a chill run down my spine. You know how she is, Dad. The box was entirely too light. I pressed the gold latch and the lid popped open. The velvet interior was completely empty. Diane had a 2-carat diamond anniversary necklace. It was gone. It was a flawless pendant, something I had saved for 3 years to buy for our 30th anniversary. She wore it every single day. The afternoon she passed away, you know how she is, Dad. I placed it in this safe because I couldn't bear to see it sitting empty on her dresser. Its financial value easily exceeded $30,000, but its emotional value was absolutely immeasurable. It was the physical manifestation of my devotion to my wife, and now it was stolen. I gripped the empty blue box so tightly my knuckles turned white. My hands shook with a blinding, fierce rage. Leaving Know How She Is, say, wide open, I walked straight down the hallway and down the grand staircase. My heavy footsteps echoed loudly on the hardwood floor. I marched to She Is, Dad. I marched straight into the kitchen. Rachel was pouring a cup of coffee, humming softly to herself. I slammed the empty velvet box hard onto the granite countertop. You know how she is, Dad. The sharp crack of the impact made her jump. Hot coffee spilled over the rim of the mug, splashing onto her pristine white sweater. She gasped, turning to face me. Dad, what is wrong with you? She asked, her voice trembling. Where is your mother's diamond necklace, Rachel? I asked, my voice terrifyingly low and steady. Rachel froze. The color drained from her face instantly. You know how she is, Dad, leaving her looking completely pale and sick. Her eyes darted wildly around the kitchen, looking anywhere but directly at me. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, her voice dropping to a tense whisper. Fawn laughed at it. The safe upstairs was locked, I said, taking a step closer to her, turning a step closer to her. The only living people who know the combination to that specific safe are me, your late mother, and you. I just checked it. The box is empty. Where is the necklace? Small beads of sweat formed on her forehead. She took a few steps back, gripping the edge of the kitchen island. Dad, I swear I didn't touch it. You must have moved it somewhere else. Don't lie to me in my own house. I warned her. Absolute fury finally breaking through my calm exteriors. That necklace hasn't left that safe in 2 years. That necklace hasn't left that safe in 2 years. Before she could manufacture another pathetic excuse, the heavy oak front door swung open. Derek stepped into the kitchen, shedding his expensive wool coat. You know how she is, Dad? He immediately picked up on the high-tension atmosphere in the room. His gaze swept from my angry face to the empty velvet box on the counter, and then to his terrified wife. He didn't look surprised. He looked annoyed. What's going on in here? Derek asked, smoothly stepping between Rachel and me. He crossed his arms over his chest, adopting a condescending, aggressive posture. The diamond anniversary necklace I gave, Diane, is missing from my personal wall safe, I told him, refusing to back down. And Rachel is the only living person who had the access code. Derek let out a long, exaggerated sigh. He dropped his arms and looked at me with a deeply patronizing expression of sympathy. It was a stage actor-level performance. Come on, old man, Derek said, his tone dripping with arrogance. Listen to what you're saying right now. You're aggressively accusing your own daughter of being a common thief over a piece of jewelry. You probably just misplaced it yourself. I haven't misplaced anything, I said firmly. Derek took a step closer to me, lowering his voice to a soothing yet deeply insulting register. Victor, let's be completely honest. The stress of living in this massive house alone, the grief of losing Diane, it's been incredibly hard on you. Your memory is clearly failing. You know how she is You've been slipping lately. Don't you remember our conversation last month? Told me you were worried about keeping something so valuable in a simple wall safe. You said you moved the diamond necklace to a safety. Security? I stared at him, feeling the sheer weight of his monstrous fawn over me, feeling the sheer weight of his monstrous lie wash over me. He was actively trying to rewrite my reality. He was executing a massive gaslighting campaign, hoping to make me doubt my own campaign, hoping to make me doubt my own sanity. He wanted to lay the groundwork to declare me mentally incompetent, exactly as I suspected. I looked at Rachel. She remained completely silent, refusing to meet my eyes, silently consenting to her husband, painting me as a senile, confused old fool. Painting me as a senile, I realized in that exact moment that confronting them right now would be tactically disastrous. If I fought back, if I screamed and called the police, they would use emotional outburst as documentus my alleged mental instability proof of my alleged mental instability. They would accelerate the timeline of whatever vicious plan they were executing. I need to swallow my pride. I needed to play the exact role they had written for me. I let my shoulders slump heavily with defeat. I guess my mind is playing tricks on me, I murmured softly. I turned to walk away, catching Derek, flashing a victorious smirk at Rachel in the mirror. I walked down the basement stairs, counting each step, focusing on the physical sensation of the wood beneath my shoes to keep my own mind absolutely clear. How she is, Dad. The cruel smirk I had seen in the hallway mirror was burned into my mind. It was the most absolute confirmation I needed. Derek wasn't just stealing from me. You know how she is, Dad. He was actively constructing a narrative of my mental decline. You know how she is, Dad. If a vulnerable 70-year-old man starts claiming his jewelry was stolen, and his daughter and son-in-law insist he just lost it due to memory loss, society is always going to believe the younger generation. It was an intensely terrifying, flawless strategy. I sat alone on my basement bed, letting the cold reality sink in. I was trapped in a psychological cage match with a man who had no moral boundaries, and my own daughter was his silent accomplice. You know how she is, Dad. I knew I couldn't confront them directly anymore. I had to become a ghost. I had to completely transform into the pathetic, frail old man they so desperately wanted me to be. You know how she is, Dad, while maintaining the sharp, analytical mind of a master engineer in the shadows. 2 days passed in a tense, deliberate peace. I played my character flawlessly. I asked Rachel the same tedious question twice within an hour. I purposely left my reading glasses in the kitchen and acted profoundly confused when Derek dramatically found them for me in the living room. Every time I played dumb, you know how she is, Dad, I saw that familiar, sickening flash of satisfaction cross Derek's face. He was arrogant. You know how she is, Dad. He was, and arrogance breeds careless mistakes. On Thursday afternoon, the weather was exceptionally clear and freezing. I put on my heavy wool coat and walking shoes. I walked slowly up to the kitchen, where Rachel was preparing a late lunch, and Derek was furiously typing away on his laptop at the island. In a weak, you know how she is, Dad. In a weak, slightly trembling voice, I announced that I was going for a long walk around the neighborhood to clear my foggy head. Rachel barely looked up from her cutting board, giving a dismissive nod. Derek didn't even acknowledge my existence. I walked out the front door, making sure to close it with a loud, definitive thud. I walked down the long paved driveway, turned the corner, and stepped out of their line of sight. But I didn't keep exactly sin silently. I waited, keep walking 10 minutes, standing silently behind the brick pillar of my neighbor's fence. Then I doubled back. I moved silently, hug thick evergreen hedge that lined the perimeter of my estate. I approached the tall wooden side gate that led directly into the spacious backyard. I knew the latch was a bit rusty and prone to squeaking, so I lifted the heavy wooden plank slightly as I unlatched it, letting it swing open in absolute silence. I slipped into the backyard. You know how she is, Dad, concealing myself behind the massive weeping willow tree at the edge of the stone patio. My garden was my absolute pride and joy. Diane and I had spent countless weekends planting azalea bushes, laying down slate walkways. You know how she is, Dad, and building the massive wooden pergola that provided shade during the humid summer months. It was a space designed for quiet reflection and family gatherings. But today, you know how, Dad, the sanctity of my garden was being deeply profaned. Standing directly in the center of the manicured lawn was Derek. He wasn't alone. He was accompanied by 3 men I had never seen before in my life. They weren't wearing the casual attire common among friends in the neighborhood, nor the standard polo shirts of local contractors. They wore sharp, finely tailored dark suits. How shoes mastered. They stood in expensive leather shoes that sank into the soft winter grass, looking completely out of place. One of the men smoked a thick cigar, mindlessly flicking the gray ash onto Diane's prized rose bushes. Another held a leather briefcase, making notes with a sleek silver pen. He'd laughed about it. They moved with a predatory confidence, their eyes scanning the expansive property, checking the slate roof, the custom windows, and the deep line of woods bordering the lot. Derek stood at the center of the group, his chest puffed out, his hands resting confidently on his hips. He pointed toward the main structure of the house, making an incredibly exaggerated sweeping gesture with his arm. He was giving them a guided tour of my property, displaying his vast domain with the absolute authority of a wealthy landlord. I held my breath, remaining absolutely still behind the low-hanging branches of the willow. The biting cold wind carried their voices clearly across the open lawn. I focused entirely on catching Derek's words, filtering out the rustle of the leaves and the distant traffic. As you can see, gentlemen, Derek said loudly, his voice filled with a sickening, manufactured bravado. The property sits on over 2 acres of prime. Fully know how she is, Dad. Fully developed real estate in one of the most exclusive zip codes in the entire state. The structural integrity is flawless. You know how she is, Dad, and the market value has absolutely skyrocketed in just the past 5 years alone. The man with the cigar took a deep drag, exhaling thick smoke into the crisp air. He looked at the main house, his eyes narrowing with cold calculation. It's a massive asset, Derek, I'll grant you that. But we need absolute assurances. Our capital is not a charity fund. If you know how she is, Dad, if we bridge this gap for your firm, we need to know the asset is completely unencumbered and fully accessible. Derek laughed, a smooth, intensely arrogant sound that made my stomach turn with intense disgust. He stepped closer to the men, lowering his voice slightly, but not enough to escape my ears. Mysot, I understand your concerns, gentlemen, but I assure you there is absolutely zero risk here. You know how she is. You've already seen the preliminary documentation I provided. The collateral is ironclad. My inheritance is secure. The word inheritance hit me like a physical strike. You know how she is, Dad. A man does not inherit an estate from a living father-in-law. An inheritance only changes hands when the current owner passes away. You know how she is, Dad, or is legally stripped of their rights and entire assets. How she is, Dad. My mind spun, piecing together the shredded bank letter, the missing diamonds, the gaslighting, and this secret tour of my home. They laughed about. They were using my house to moffend his failing ambitions. The man with the leather briefcase stopped writing and looked up. You know how she is, Dad, his gaze drifting toward the window of my basement suite. He tapped his dark leather folder with his silver pen. You know how she is, Dad. And what about the current title holder? The man asked, his tone flat and purely transactional. What about the old man? You know how she is, Dad. Is he going to cause legal problems for us when the transfer goes into effect? Derek shoved his hands into the pockets of his expensive wool coat. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face, exposing a dark side I hadn't truly understood until that very second. You know how she is, Dad. He looked back at the grand house I had built to protect my beloved family, his eyes completely devoid of any human empathy. Don't worry about Victor, Derek replied. You know how she is, Dad. His voice dropping to a freezing, ruthless whisper that cut through the bitter winter air. He won't be an issue for much longer. You know how she's. Those chilling words hung heavily in the freezing air, an absolute promise of my impending erasure. The paralyzing shock that had held me for weeks completely vanished, replaced by a crystal clarity. You know how she is, Dad. Derek wasn't just a greedy opportunist trying to steal jewelry or get a comfortable free ride in my house. He was a dangerous predator actively plotting my ruin. You know how she is? I waited patiently until the men in the tailored suits finally shook hands with Derek and walked toward their luxury cars. I listened to Bass closely. I listened calmly as Derek whistled a light tune and walked nonchalantly back inside my house, as if he had just conquered a nation. The moment the heavy back door shut tight, I immediately retraced my steps, slipping through the rusty side gate and re-entering the house through the freezing basement. Laughed about it. A veteran structural engineer knows exactly what to do when a towering building is on the verge of a total collapse. You don't try to patch deep cracks with cheap plaster. You support foundation. You support failing foundation with heavy, cold steel. I could no longer fight this silent psychological war relying solely on my own limited observations. I needed a professional expert. I needed a shark. You know how she is, Dad. The next morning, I carefully put on my best wool trousers and a crisp collared shirt. I walked slowly up to the bright kitchen. You know how she is, Dad, where Rachel was mindlessly sipping a green smoothie. In the weakest, most pathetic voice I could manage. You know how she is, Dad. I told her I was taking the city bus to the community center to play chess. She barely looked at me, giving a cold, dismissive wave. He'd laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad. I walked out the front door leaning heavily on a wooden cane, perfectly playing the part of the broken old man they expected me to be. The second I was 3 quiet blocks away, I immediately straightened my spine, folded up the wooden cane, and called an Uber. The long drive into downtown D.C. was a fast blur of gray concrete. You know how she is, Dad. I watched the towering corporate buildings pass by, massive structures standing proudly against the skyline. I drew a deep, quiet strength from them. I am Victor Thorne. He'd laughed at a man who built massive monuments that easily withstand hurricanes. I would absolutely never allow a pathetic, arrogant parasite to destroy my life. You know how she is, Dad? The black Uber dropped me in front of a sleek high-rise on K Street. I took the stuck express elevator straight to the 34th floor and stepped into the plush, intimidating reception area of Cole and Associates. Harrison Cole wasn't just a lawyer. You know how she is, Dad. He was a ruthless legal mercenary. For 30 years, he had been my exclusive corporate attorney. You know how she is, Dad. Aggressively defending my engineering firm against frivolous lawsuits and handling complex municipal contracts. He ate corporate predators for breakfast. The sharp receptionist recognized me instantly and escorted me directly into Harrison's spacious corner office. Harrison sat confidently behind a massive piece of polished mahogany. He was a lean, imposing man with silver hair and a pair of sharp, hawkish eyes. He looked up. You know how she is, Dad, clearly surprised by my sudden arrival, but quickly rose to shake my hand. I didn't waste any time on empty pleasantries. Sitting in the leather chair, I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out the small pouch containing back letter. I placed it gently on his spotless desk and told him absolutely everything. I detailed the agonizingly slow invasion of my home, the destroyed antique dresser, the stolen Jimin necklace, the secret garden tour, and the juror secret that conversation I had secretly overheard yesterday. Harrison listened with a terrifying, absolute stillness, his sharp eyes visibly darkening with a cold, highly professional fury. You know how she is. He carefully picked up the reconstructed bank letter, examining it silently under the bright glow of his desk lamp. Victor, Harrison finally spoke. You know how she is, his voice dropping to a deep, dangerous rumble. This is not a simple, isolated case of elder abuse. This is a highly orchestrated, sophisticated financial crime. You know how she is, Dad. They are actively trying to liquidate your entire life. You know how she is, Dad. Harrison turned to his computer immediately, his fingers flying across the black keyboard. I'm pulling up the county property records right now, he muttered, with intense focus. I also have a direct line to the internal fraud department at your bank. If they initiated a home equity line of credit using your property as collateral, the digital footprint will absolutely be in the central database. The massive office fell into a tense, intensely suffocating silence. I listened to the frantic clicking of his keys. Each passing second felt like a painful hour. I know how she is. I watched his eyes narrow sharply as he scrolled rapidly through dense streams of digital financial information. Then he stopped suddenly. He let out a heavy, "You know how she is, Dad," bitter breath and leaned back hard against the plush leather of his chair. It is infinitely worse than you think, Victor, Harrison said gravely. The one. You know how she is, Dad. $5 million line of credit is absolutely real. But it's not just in the preliminary application stage. It is currently in the final underwriting phase. The bank has already completed a drive-by appraisal of your entire estate. The massive funds are scheduled to be disbursed directly into a newly created joint account in exactly 14 days. In 2 weeks, Derek will have direct, unrestricted access to $1.5 million of your home's equity. I felt the warm blood drain from my face completely. How is that even remotely possible, Harrison? I've never spoken to a single loan officer. I've never signed a single application. They need physical signatures. How she is, they need a certified notary. You know how she is, Dad? They absolutely require my physical presence to authorize a massive loan against an unencumbered property. Harrison's expression grew extraordinarily grim. You know how she is, Dad? He opened a new digital tab, navigated rapidly through a specific legal database, and downloaded a hidden file. The office printer buzzed loudly, spitting out a thick stack of warm paper. Seat. Stapling the top left corner securely, Harrison slowly slid the heavy, devastating document across the polished mahogany desk straight toward me. You know how she is, Dad. They didn't need you to physically appear anywhere, Victor, Harrison said softly, tapping his index finger heavily at the very top of the first page. Because legally, you already gave them absolute undisputed permission to do whatever they want. You know how she is, Dad. I stared down blankly at the paperwork. The bold black letters, printed at the top of the page, seemed to burn directly into my retinas. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. I read through the horrific, legally binding clauses. You know how she is, Dad. The document granted Rachel Thorne Mitchell complete and total control over all my financial assets, my personal bank accounts, my real estate, and my healthcare decisions. It legally declared her fully authorized as a sergeant in a matter, effectively stripping me of my autonomy. I never drafted this, I whispered softly, my voice shaking with a deep, absolute horror. You know how she is, Dad. I've never seen this document in my life. Look closely at the very bottom of the final page, Victor, Harrison instructed explicitly, his steady tone laced with a boiling, lethal anger. I flipped frantically through the thick pages. There, at the very bottom of the last page, you know how she is, Dad. Right next to the official blue stamp of a deeply compromised notary public was my signature. It wasn't a sloppy, rushed imitation. It was a flawless, absolutely perfect replication of my unique personal handwriting. Every smooth loop, every sharp angle, and every subtle pressure point was exactly the way I had signed my name to thousands of complex architectural blueprints over a mass span of 40 years. It was a masterclass in forgery. The brutal reality of Harrison's revelation hung heavily in the cold air of the office, an absolute promise of my impending erasure. The paralyzing shock that had held me for weeks completely evaporated instantly, replaced by a crystal clarity. Derek wasn't just a greedy opportunist trying to steal jewelry or live comfortably for free in my house. He was a dangerous, calculating dad. He was a dangerous predator actively plotting my total destruction. Harrison stared at the document, his jaw clenched so tightly that I could see the feathered muscle fibers beneath his skin. For a man who had spent 30 years navigating the treacherous waters of corporate litigation, he rarely showed genuine shock. But this blatant criminal act executed against a client he considered a longtime friend crossed an intensely personal line. He placed the paperwork back down carefully, looking at me with a cold, terrifying desk, looking at Vimware cold, terrifying resolve. We were no longer dealing with an entitled son-in-law. You know how shitters it. We were facing a desperate criminal who systematically planned to strip me of every single asset I had built over 40 years of hard work. You know how she is, Dad. We can't afford to just react, Victor, Harrison declared, his voice dropping to a low, commanding whisper. If we file a police report right now based on this forgery, you know how she is, Dad. Derek will know instantly that we are on to him. He will panic. You know how she is, Dad. He'll destroy any physical evidence left in your house, drain any liquid accounts he currently has access to, and potentially flee the jurisdiction entirely. Or worse, you know how she is. He'll accelerate whatever physical timeline he has planned for you. Before we strike back, we need absolute, overwhelming evidence of his entire operation. We need to dismantle him completely. Huh? I nodded slowly, feeling a cold, dark determination settle deep into my bones. The intense shock was gone entirely of a structural engineer analyzing a building scheduled for demolition. What is our next move? Harrison? Harrison reached for the phone on his desk, pressing a button on the intercom. He instructed his secretary to cancel all of his afternoon appointments and summon a man named Marcus Vance immediately. 20 minutes later, you know how she is, Dad. The heavy oak door of the office swung open. Marcus was a former federal forensic accountant who now ran an elite, highly discreet private investigation firm catering to high-net-worth clients facing complex financial extortion. He was a quiet, unassuming man with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every single object in the room instantly. Harrison briefed him quickly. Harrison, the forged power of attorney, sliding the forged power of Arnie, and the shredded bank letter across the stacks. Marcus reviewed the documents in complete silence, his expression entirely unreadable. Tuesday. I want a comprehensive absolute shadow investigation into Derek Mitchell, Harrison instructed firmly. I want to know where every single dime of his money is coming from, exactly where it is, Dad, and exactly where it is going. I want the absolute truth about this tech startup he claims to be running out of my client's house. Dig into his personal accounts. You know how she is, Dad, his digital footprint, and his business filings. Leave absolutely no corner unturned. Marcus simply nodded, sliding the paperwork into a sleek leather briefcase. Give me exactly 70 analysis of his entire life. Give an to Elice of his entire lives. For the next 3 days, my own home, an active war zone where the own home felt like an active war where the enemy felt he was completely oblivious that the battle had already begun. She is, Dad. I continued to play the role of the frail, mentally declining father perfectly. I walked with a heavy limp. I purposely left the stove burner on for a few minutes until Rachel noticed, apologizing profusely for my dangerous forgetfulness while Derek watched with that sickening, victorious smirk. Every time I looked at him, I felt a surge of violent anger, but I forced it down. You know how she is, Dad. I was buying Marcus the precious time he needed to uncover the absolute truth. On Friday morning, you know how she is, Dad. Harrison called my encrypted burner phone, a device he had purchased specifically for me to ensure Derek couldn't intercept our communications on the home network. You know how she is, Dad. He told me to come to the office immediately. When I arrived, Marcus was already sitting in the leather chair across from Harrison's desk. The wide glass table in the center of the room was completely covered in thick, color-coded financial dossiers. Marcus offered no warm greetings. He simply pointed to the thickest stack of documents on the table. Your son-in-law is not a tech entrepreneur, Victor, Marcus began, his tone completely clinical and devoid of emotion. The company he claims to be running, the one that supposedly required your library as a corporate headquarters, is a total sham. It is a legally registered entity, but it has absolutely no operational infrastructure. It has 0 employees on payroll, 0 active clients, and 0 viable products under development. You know how she is, Dad. It is merely a hollow financial shell designed to look legitimate on paper. I stared at the thick dossier, a cold sense of vindication washing over me. Then what on earth is he doing locked in my library for 10 hours a day? Marcus pulled a second folder from the pile and opened it. He is furiously day trading cryptocurrency, and he is losing catastrophically. You know how over the past 14 months, Derek has systematically emptied his entire personal savings. His retirement accounts, you know how she is, Dad, and a substantial inheritance that Rachel received from her grandmother. He's been chasing highly volatile digital coins on unregulated offshore exchanges. You know how she is, Dad, gambling away nearly $700,000. The sheer scale of the financial destruction made me catch my breath. You know how she is, Dad. He hadn't just ruined his own financial future. He was actively destroying my daughter's financial security while smiling right to my face every single day. You know how she is, Dad. But losing his own money isn't the catalyst for his current actions, Marcus continued, his voice dropping noticeably darker. 6 months ago, you know how she is, Dad. When the legitimate funds ran dry, Derek became desperate. He borrowed heavily to try and recover his massive losses. He didn't go to a regular bank. He went to unregulated, highly dangerous private lenders, loan sharks. You know how she is, Dad. He currently owes over $400,000 in high-interest debt, and these lenders do not send polite collection letters. They are threatening him. That is the immense pressure driving his actions. You know how she is, Dad. That is exactly why he forged your signature to open a $1.5 million line of credit against your debt-free home. He is literally trying to save his own skin by completely destroying your life. Everything made a horrific, absolute sense. The forced takeover of my home. You know how she is, Dad. The destruction of Diane's dresser to assert dominance, the interception of the Daily Mail. He was a desperate, drowning man. He was a desperate, frowning man pulling me under the freezing water just to keep himself afloat. The financial evidence we have here is more than enough to send him to a federal prison for a decade, Harrison said, slamming his hands firmly onto the desk. We can launch the legal strike tomorrow morning. Before you make your move, you both need to see the final piece of the puzzle. Huh? Marcus interrupted, pulling a thin file from his briefcase. He didn't slide it across the desk. He held it in his hands, looking at me with a profound, unusual sense of deep human sympathy. During the course of my digital investigation, I gained access to Derek's deleted email archives and his private browsing history, Marcus explained softly. I wanted to know what his exit strategy was once the bank disbursed the $1.5 million into the joint account. Stealing the money is only half the battle. You know how she is, Dad. He still needed a permanent way to incapacitate you, Victor. He needed to ensure you could never legally challenge the fraudulent transfer or report the massive theft to the police. A heavy, freezing dread into the pit of my stomach. A heavy, freezing dread settled into the pit of my stomach. What did he do? My voice barely audible. Marcus opened the thin folder and placed the printed email exchanges directly in front of me. You know how she is, Dad. 2 weeks ago, right around the time he started convincing Rachel that your memory was failing, Derek contacted the director of an extremely luxurious, premium private care facility located in a remote part of upstate New York. This is a specialized, high-security institution designed exclusively for patients suffering from severe, advanced dementia and profound cognitive decline. You know how she is, Dad. I stared down at the printed words on the paper, my eyes scanning the horrific, calculating correspondence. Derek had been actively negotiating the monthly care fees and planning to use my own stolen funds to pay for my permanent confinement. He sent them heavily altered copies of your medical records, exaggerating your minor joint issues into severe your minor incatation in Tuesdays. Marcus, severe physical absentation, continued grimly. He explicitly cited the forged power of attorney to bypass the consent required about their lockdown protocols. He specifically asked about their lockdown protocols. He wanted absolute written assurances. He wanted absolute written assurances from the facility director that once a patient is involuntarily admitted by a legal agent under a medical directive, they cannot, under any circumstances, discharge themselves, regardless of how lucid they appear. The room spun slightly. I gripped the wooden armrests of the leather chair to steady myself. You know who she is, Dad? They weren't just planning to steal my money and leave me with nothing. They were planning to lock me away in a secure, isolated medical facility. They intended to chemically sedate me, strip me of my basic human rights, and leave me to rot in a locked ward until I passed away. Complete me to rot in a locked ward until I passed away. Completely alone and thoroughly forgotten. You know how she is, Dad. What is the date of admission? I asked, forcing the horrific words past a tight, choking lump in my throat. Marcus looked down at the final page of the file. He finalized the involuntary admission paperwork yesterday afternoon. They are scheduled to come pick you up on Friday morning. I took a slow, deep breath. I let the chilling reality of Friday morning wash over me, settling deep into my bones. Today was Tuesday. You know how she is, Dad. I had exactly 72 hours to dismantle the trap built around my life. Simply knowing the truth was no longer enough. I needed irrefutable proof of their malicious intent. I needed to catch their conspiracy in real time, completely bypassing the financial paperwork. I needed them how she is, Dad. I needed them to confess to an empty room. To accomplish this, I had to completely lean into the pathetic caricature they had drawn of me. I had to become the helpless old man they were so eager to lock away. On Wednesday morning, I put my plan into motion. I waited until I heard the heavy sound of Derek's footsteps pacing across the hard floor above me. You know how she is. I climbed the wooden stairs, making sure my breathing sounded heavy and labored. The moment I reached the kitchen, I let my right leg collapse entirely. I let out a sharp, how she is, Dad, loud cry of agony, gripping the edge of the granite countertop as if my life depended on it, before dropping heavily to the floor. Rachel gasped, her ceramic coffee mug crashing loudly into the sink. Derek stared down at me with a cold, analytical gaze. Dad, what's wrong? Rachel asked, her voice trembling slightly. My back, I groaned, clutching my lower spine. A severe spasm. I can barely move my legs. The pain is blinding. Derek knelt down. Do you need me to call an ambulance, Victor? We can get you to the emergency room for an evaluation. I know how she is, Dad. I knew exactly what an emergency room visit meant. It meant creating a medical record demonstrating my vulnerability and creating a fast-track justification for sending me to that locked facility he had chosen. I shook my head forcefully. No hospitals, I rasped Shayada. You know how she is, Dad. I just need undisturbed rest. Help me get back to my bed in the basement. I don't want to be a burden up here. The flash of relief that crossed Derek's face was impossible to miss. A bedridden father-in-law trapped in the basement was the perfect prelude to a forced medical extraction. You know how she is, Dad. On Friday morning, Derek and Rachel practically carried my dead weight down the narrow stairs. I groaned with every single step. You know how she is, Dad. Delivering the greatest performance of my life. They deposited me onto the stiff mattress. I closed my eyes, requesting that they leave me in total darkness so I could try to sleep. We'll check on you later, Victor, Derek said smoothly. Get some rest. Don't try to move. I listened intently as their footsteps retreated up the stairs. The heavy basement door clicked shut. I waited for 4 full hours in the absolute silence. I didn't move a single muscle. You know how she is, Dad. I lay there calculating the perfect angles and sight lines for what I needed to do next. At 6 o'clock that evening, I heard the muffled sounds of preparation from above. Rachel and Derek were getting ready to go out. Derek had bragged about having a crucial dinner tonight with his new private investors at an upscale downtown steakhouse. I heard the front door shut. I listened as the heavy engine roared to life, the tires crunching on the paved driveway as they drove away. The house fell into a hollow silence. I threw off the covers and stood up, my spine straight, my legs steady and powerful, tucked the small black box I had obtained Marcus yesterday. Directly from Marcus yesterday. Inside was a set of 4 military-grade, high-definition pinhole cameras. These were advanced, motion-activated recording devices equipped with infrared night vision, ultra-wide-angle lenses, and direct cellular upload capabilities. I grabbed the box and walked quickly up the basement stairs. I knew every structural beam, every hidden wire, and every subtle shadow within these walls. This sanctuary was my creation, and I knew exactly how to wire it. I dragged a chair to the center of the room. I popped off the cover of the smoke detector in the corner. Working with absolute precision, I spliced the tiny camera's wires into the power supply, drilling a microscopic hole for the lens to peer through. The bosom. From the floor, it was completely invisible, perfectly camouflaged against the white ceiling. Next, I moved to the kitchen. This was the central hub of their daily operations. You know how she is, Dad, the place where Derek issued his commands and Rachel demonstrated her silent compliance. I climbed onto the granite countertop. You know how she is, Dad, reaching deep into the dark recess above the highest cabinet door. I secured the second camera, angling the lens downward the entire kitchen island. I wired it directly into the hidden LED circuit. The final location was my former library. This was the belly of the beast, the room where he shredded my mail, forged my signature, and communicated with dangerous loan sharks. You know how she is, Dad. I approached the heavy double doors, my heart beating steadily, and stepped inside. Here I needed 2 cameras to capture both the desk area and the main seating space. You know how she is, Dad. I walked over to the towering walnut bookshelves I had built with my own hands. Pulling down a heavy volume on Gothic architecture. You know how she is, Dad. I used a utility knife to carefully hollow out the thick spine and embedded the third camera. The lens was completely hidden within the dark crease. Between the pages, providing a wide-angle view of the desk. For the fourth camera, I unscrewed the bronze heating vent near the bay window. I secured the tiny device to the interior metal wall, angling the lens to peer through the slanted slats. It provided a perfect cross angle of the entire room. The installation process took a full 5 hours. My muscles ached from the intense labor, but my mind was remarkably clear. I moved through the main floor. You know how she is, Dad, meticulously erasing any subtle trace of my presence. I left the house looking exactly as it had when they departed. I retreated down the stairs. You know how she is, Dad, descending back into the freezing isolation of my basement suite. You know how she is, Dad. Closing the door gently, I felt a profound sense of tactical accomplishment. I washed my hands in the small bathroom sink, changed back into my pajamas. You know how she is, Dad, and sat on the edge of the stiff mattress. I pulled the iPad Marcus had provided from beneath my pillow. Powering on the device, I launched the encrypted security application and entered a complex alphanumeric passcode. The screen flashed twice, clearing the loading sequence. The display split into 4 distinct, high-definition video streams. I could see the grand living room, the tidy kitchen, and both perfect angles of the library. and both perfect angles of the library. Empty house in sharp, highly detailed pitch black, empty house in sharp, highly detailed shades of gray and white. I know how she is, Dad. The audio inputs were incredibly sensitive, catching even the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the distant hallway. I leaned back against the cold wall. You know how she is, Dad, the glowing iPad resting on my lap. Looking at the 4 silent screens, I was the ultimate architect of my own defense, waiting patiently in the dark. You know, Digital Trap was fully set, powered, and actively recording. 20 minutes later, the distinct sound of tires crunching on the paved driveway echoed clearly through the sensitive audio input. I watched the kitchen screen intently. The heavy front door swung open, casting a long, stark shadow across the hardwood floor. Rachel and Derek walked through the doorway, laughing loudly, completely oblivious that they had just stepped directly onto a live, heavily monitored stage. You know how she is, Dad. The show was about to begin, and I was holding the director's script. I watched the tablet screen illuminate the dark walls of my basement prison. Rachel and Derek moved through the kitchen in an easy domestic rhythm. Derek poured 2 glasses of red wine. Derek poured Zed, while Rachel picked at a platter of imported cheeses. They looked like a normal, successful young corporate meetings. To an untrained eye, their interaction was mundane and affectionate. But through my hidden lenses, through dumb lenses, sinister. Their casual laughter sounded hollow and sinister. I sat stiffly on my mattress for hours. My eyes darting between the video feeds, logging every frame. The timer in the corner of my screen ticked past midnight. The house above me grew quiet. The kitchen feed went dark as Derek flipped off the lights. Moment flashed with monochromatic clarity. Suddenly flashed with monochromatic. You know how she is, Dad. The infrared sensors had detected movement in the room. Derek stepped into my former sanctuary, swirling a glass of amber liquid. He sank heavily into the leather chair behind the desk, rubbing his temples with both hands. He didn't look like a confident tech pioneer anymore. Under the harsh glare of the lamp, he looked like a man utterly exhausted and carrying an immense burden. The silence in the basement was absolute, save for the thumping of my own heart. Lest I adjusted the volume control on the tablet, making sure I would catch every single sound. A few minutes later, the heavy wooden door of the library was pushed open again. Rachel walked into the room, wrapped in a thick cashmere robe. She closed the door behind her and turned the brass deadbolt, a sharp click echoing through my headphones. The atmosphere on the screen changed instantly. The domestic warmth they had projected earlier completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating tension. The glowing tablet, I leaned closer to the glowing tablet, pressing the earphones deeper into my ears to catch every syllable, my heart beating wildly and painfully against my ribs. Did you talk to the underwriter today? Rachel asked, her voice dropping to an anxious whisper as she paced back and forth across the Persian rug. Derek, how she is, Dad. Derek took a slow sip of his drink and nodded, leaning forward to rest his elbows on the polished glass desktop. I spent the afternoon finalizing the wire transfer protocols. You know how she is? Derek replied smoothly, his tone laced with a dark, triumphant energy. The bank underwriters approved the final property valuation this morning. You know how she is, Dad. The financial paperwork is locked in. Once the $1.5 million line of credit hits our joint account on the 26th of this month, this nightmare is officially over. The private lenders get paid off by noon. Those violent thugs will stop calling my personal number. My debt. Watched my daughter. Stop her pacing. I watched my daughter wipe clean. I watched my I-20 She stood in front of the desk, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I waited in the cold darkness for a natural human reaction. I waited for her to acknowledge the immense gravity of the financial crime they were committing, against her own flesh and blood. I prayed to hear even a shred of moral hesitation in her voice. "And how are we handling the primary obstacle?" Rachel asked flatly, her voice completely devoid of human emotion. He'd laughed about it. "You know how she is, Dad. We can't exactly celebrate our financial freedom if he's still wandering around the house, calling his bank, or trying to contact his lawyer. We need to stick to the timeline." The cold detachment in her voice shattered my heart into a million pieces. "You know how she is, Dad?" She spoke about her father as if I were a broken appliance to be discarded, a logistical hassle getting in the way of her comfort. Hughesday. She didn't even use my name. I was merely the primary obstacle. Derek laughed. A chilling, predatory expression distorted his handsome features on the screen. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "The obstacle is already taken care of." Derek Lack, his voice, as Derek assured her, his voice dripping with a sickening arrogance. The facility in upstate New York sent over the final admission itinerary this afternoon. The lockdown ward has a private, isolated suite fully prepared for him. We pack your dad into the medical transport vehicle on the morning of the 27th. The medical escorts will handle pulling him out of the house. We won't have to lift a single finger. Derek paused, taking another sip of his drink before delivering the final blow. The moment transport deliberate sips clears his drink before delivering the final blow. The moment that transport vehicle clears the driveway, we drive straight to the international airport. We're flying first class to Hawaii for New Year's Eve. While we're laying on the beach, sipping expensive champagne, he'll be permanently settled into his new, heavily medicated home. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring from a toxic mix of profound grief and boiling fury. I felt a physical ache radiating through my chest, a deep, crushing pain that threatened to suffocate me in the dark basement. My daughter was plotting to lock me away in a chemical prison so she could enjoy a tropical vacation, funded entirely by my stolen equity. I held my breath, desperately waiting for Rachel to finally speak. This was the absolute point of no return. A tiny, foolish part of my broken soul still hoped she would break down, that she would realize the monstrous nature of what they were planning and refuse to go through with it. I wanted her to cry. I wanted her to protect me. Did not cry. Rachel, she did not protect her father. She didn't show a single ounce of remorse, empathy, or hesitation. "So you know how she is, Dad?" She simply dropped her arms, stepped closer to the glass desk, and looked down at her husband with an expression of pure, calculating pragmatism. "Are you absolutely certain the specialist will sign off on the severe dementia diagnosis?" Rachel asked coldly, her tone sharp and precise. "If the facility's receiving physician questions his lucidity during the initial psychiatric evaluation, they could reject the involuntary admission. If them aware of his competent, the aware of his surroundings, the power attorney becomes useless. The power of attorney, loose ends or legal complications. We can't afford any loose ends or legal complications." Derek chuckled softly, the dark rumbling vibration echoing loudly in my headphones. He reached down to open the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila folder. He dropped it onto the glass surface. The heavy folder landed with a dull, definitive thud. "You worry too much, my love," Derek said confidently, tapping his index finger on the top of the manila cover. I paid a $10,000 retainer to a private, highly flexible neurologist who specializes in confidential medical certifications. He never even needs to see your father in person to diagnose him. I provided the doctor with a completely fabricated list of severe symptoms, a completely verbal list of severe symptoms, and aggressive behavioral anomalies. He drafted an absolutely airtight, incredibly detailed diagnostic report officially confirming advanced cognitive decline and severe paranoia. Derek picked up the fabricated medical file, waving it slightly in the air, his dark smirk widening into a triumphant, boastful grin. "It's already done." The boastful grin on Derek's face burned through the glancing screen of my tablet, branding itself permanently into my memory. "It's already done." Those simple words echoed through the freezing, damp air of the basement, sealing the absolute death of the family I thought I knew. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, watching the silent video feed as Derek casually tossed the forged medical file back into the desk drawer and locked it. Rachel simply nodded, her face a chilling mask of indifference. Mask of indifference, before wrapping her thick cashmere robe tighter around her shoulders and turning toward the library door. "You know how she is, Dad?" I watched them walk out, leaving the room to plunge back into darkness. I didn't shed a single tear. The profound, suffocating grief that had threatened to crush my chest just moments ago completely evaporated, replaced by a freezing, absolute finality. The daughter I had raised with endless love, the little girl whose scraped knees I had bandaged and whose expensive college tuition I had paid in full without a second thought, was officially gone. In her place stood a cold accomplice to a horrifying crime. They weren't just stealing my home, they were stealing my freedom, my dignity, and my future. Tuesdayed. "You know how she is." I pressed the power button on the iPad, plunging my tiny sanctuary into complete and utter darkness. The time for mourning was absolutely over. The hour of absolute dismantling had arrived. When I finally opened my eyes again, a pale, "You know how she is?" gray light was filtering through the narrow window near the ceiling of my basement suite. It was the early morning of Christmas Eve. Outside, a thick blanket of pure, untouched snow covered the expansive lawns of my estate, creating a picture-perfect winter wonderland that stood in stark contrast to the ugly, rotting reality fermenting within the walls of the house. For decades, Christmas Eve had been a sacred, joyful tradition in our household. Diane would spend days baking cinnamon pastries, and the house would be filled with the warm, rich aromas of pine needles and roasting meats. "You know how she is, Dad." We would sit by the crackling fireplace listening to classic carols, cherishing the simple warmth of our family. Now, this festive holiday was nothing more than a convenient ticking clock marking the final countdown to my planned institutionalization. Tomorrow was December 25th. The day after tomorrow was the 26th, the day the $1.5 million line of credit was scheduled to clear. "You know how she is, Dad." It was the day they intended to pay off those dangerous lenders. And the day after that, the 27th, he'd laughed about it, was the exact date the medical transport vehicle was scheduled to arrive and drag me away to a locked dementia ward. "You know how she is, Dad." I threw off the thin blanket and stood up, ignoring the biting cold of the concrete floor. I had to maintain my performance with absolute, flawless precision. I dressed slowly, selecting Seabed a faded, somewhat wrinkled flannel-loose trousers to emphasize my alleged physical decline. I practiced a blank, bewildered expression in the small bathroom mirror. Grabbing the wooden cane I had deliberately left by the door, stod. While grabbing, I began the slow, deliberately left by the door. I began the incredibly loud ascent up the wooden stairs. I pushed open the heavy wooden door leading into the main hallway and shuffled my way into the kitchen. The grand space was filled with the vibrant, energetic sounds of holiday preparation. Rachel was standing by the granite countertop. You know how she is, Dad, elegantly arranging an expensive charcuterie board, while Derek leaned against the stainless steel refrigerator, typing rapidly on his sleek smartphone. The casual, domestic atmosphere shifted subtly the moment I entered the room. You know how she is, Dad? Good morning, Dad, Rachel said, her voice dripping with a bright, entirely synthetic cheerfulness. She didn't look me in the eyes. She remained fully focused on slicing a block of aged cheese. Did you sleep well down there? I know the furnace can be a bit noisy, but we wanted to make sure you were nice and warm. I slept fine, Rachel, I replied, forcing my voice to tremble with a manufactured, pathetic weakness. My back is still incredibly stiff. The cold weather settles deep into my joints. Derek slid his phone into the pocket of his tailored trousers and walked over to the kitchen island, his beings of black coffee, picking up a steaming mug of black coffee. He'd laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad. He looked at me with that familiar, intensely insulting expression of patronizing sympathy. It took every single ounce of my willpower to keep from striking the smug, arrogant look off his face. You need to rest properly today, Victor, Derek advised, smoothly, his tone a thick fist wrapped in a thick, suffocating layer of false concern. You know how she is, Dad. Given your recent memory lapses and the clear deterioration of your physical health, it is absolutely vital that you avoid any unnecessary stress. We've been reading up on cognitive decline, and highly stimulating environments are incredibly detrimental. You just focus on letting your brain rest. You know how she is, Dad. Leave the heavy lifting of the holidays to us. We have everything completely under control. You know how she is, Dad. The sheer audacity of his words was staggering. He was actively laying the final psychological groundwork for my impending disappearance. You know how she is, Dad, gently and reflexively conditioning me to accept the role of a helpless burden. I slowly took a seat at a wooden chair in the breakfast nook. You know how she is, Dad, gripping the curved handle of my cane with trembling, liver-spotted hands. You're right, Derek, I murmured softly, staring blankly at the polished hardwood floor. My mind has felt so foggy late, Floor. I just can't seem to keep my thoughts straight anymore. I'm grateful for everything you two are doing for me. Derek quickly shot a victorious glance at Rachel. He thought I was completely broken. You know how she is, Dad. He believed the crushing weight of the pressure he had applied over the last 8 months had successfully my spirit. He had absolutely broken my spirit and shattered my defenses. I was simply waiting for the perfect moment, to detonate the foundation beneath his feet. After eating a small bowl of plain oatmeal in suffocating silence, I excused myself, claiming the bright kitchen lights were giving me a severe headache. Leaning heavily on my cane, I slowly shuffled back down the hallway, descending into the dark isolation of the basement. You know how she is, Dad. The exact second the heavy door clicked shut behind me, the frail, confused old man vanished completely. I stood up perfectly straight, tossed the wooden cane onto the bed, and pulled the encrypted burner phone from the inside pocket of my coat. Sitting at the small desk in the corner of the room, I drafted a highly secure, encrypted text message to Harrison Cole. We had been meticulously orchestrating this exact sequence of events for weeks. The legal trap was fully primed, fully props, its steel jaws ready to snap shut. "The timeline is absolutely confirmed," I typed rapidly. At 5 o'clock in the evening, "You know how she is, Dad?" The heavy basement door swung open with a loud creak. Derek stepped onto the top step, dressed in a flawless charcoal suit. He looked down at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. "Listen closely, Victor," Derek commanded aggressively. "You know how she is, Dad. Important investors are coming over tonight for a private Christmas dinner. You are an embarrassment to my image. Stay down in the basement tonight. Don't make a single sound." I simply nodded to the empty room, a silent wolf in sheep's clothing, waiting patiently for the dawn. The heavy basement door finally clicked shut. "You know how she is, Dad," leaving me in the freezing darkness. I didn't stay on the mattress. I waited for 2 full hours until the faint sounds of clinking crystal and low laughter drifted down through the floorboards above me. The dinner party was in full swing. "You know how she is, Dad." I walked over to the small closet, shedding the oversized flannel shirt and the baggy trousers. Reaching into the furthest recess, "You know how she is, Dad." I pulled out the protective garment bag I had hidden away days ago. Inside was my finest tailored suit, a perfectly cut navy wool masterpiece, paired with a brand new, crisp white shirt. I buttoned the shirt with steady, incredibly precise movements. I tied the silk tie into a flawless knot. I slipped into my polished leather Oxfords. I stood in front of the small bathroom Oxfords. I stood in front of the small bathroom mirror and looked at my reflection. The hunched, shivering, pathetic old man was completely gone. Standing in his place was Victor Thorne, master structural engineer. "You know how she is, Dad?" The man who built skyscrapers out of steel and concrete. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling an absolute surge of power flooding through my veins. I picked up the glowing iPad from the bed, checking the live digital video streams. The kitchen screen showed Derek sitting at the head of my long mahogany table, pouring expensive vintage wine for 4 distinct men. I zoomed in on their faces. I recognized every single one of them. Instantly recognized every single dossiers Marcus had provided. They weren't wearing the sharp, tailored darks shoots. Marred. Salide. They weren't wearing the sharp, tailored dark suits from the secret garden tour. "You know how she is." They wore expensive casual clothing, attempting to blend into a suburban holiday setting. But I knew exactly who they truly were. They were the highly dangerous, "You how she is, Dad," unregulated private lenders to whom Derek owed his life. They were cold-blooded loan sharks specializing in shadow transactions and aggressive debt collection. "You know how she is, Dad." Derek was actively selling them a beautifully manufactured dream. I listened to his smooth, confident voice through the hidden audio stream. He was assuring them that their massive capital capsule insured was on the verge, capital injections secure. That his tech startup was on the verge, Dexter public offering, and their prince with substantial interest by the end of the weekend. "You know how she is, Dad." He was buying their patience with my stolen money and my prized wine. I powered off the iPad and took a deep breath. It was time to pull down the rotten foundation. I walked to the base of the wooden stairs. I didn't use the wooden cane. I left it abandoned on the cold concrete floor. I climbed the stairs with a firm, heavy, unhurried stride. I made no attempt to conceal my approach. I wanted them to hear me coming. I reached the main hallway and turned toward the grand dining room. The heavy double doors were slightly ajar. "You know how she is, Dad." I could hear Rachel laughing at a joke made by one of the loan sharks. Her synthetic fake joy echoed through the house. Placing both hands firmly onto the polished brass handles, I threw the heavy mahogany doors wide open. The thick wooden barriers swung back, making a loud, authoritative slam that echoed through the luxurious room like a gunshot. The laughter died instantly, the clinking of a keepik she was mun. The laughter died instantly. The clinking of expensive crystal came to a sudden halt. 5 heads snapped rapidly in my direction. Rachel dropped her silver fork onto her porcelain plate with a sharp clank. The color drained from her face entirely, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Derek froze mid-pour. The dark, red liquid overflowed the rim of the glass. The wine spilled onto the pristine white tablecloth, spreading across the fabric like a pool of fresh blood. Derek stared at me in absolute, paralyzing shock. "You know how she is, Dad." He was looking at a man who's supposed to be a frail, broken little shell hiding in a dark basement. He was looking at a man standing perfectly straight, impeccably dressed, radiating a cold, lethal authority. The thick veins in Derek's neck bulged, his shock violently turning into pure, unadulterated panic. He slammed the wine bottle down onto the table and pushed his chair back with a harsh scrape violently piercing the tense silence. "Victor?" Derek shouted. "You know how she is, Dad." His voice cracking with a desperate, manufactured rage as he tried to maintain his fragile illusion in front of his dangerous creditors. "What are you doing up here? You know how she is, Dad. I explicitly told you to stay downstairs. You are severely confused again. You're having another episode. We have important business guests." He turned quickly to the 4 men, flashing a forced, sweating smile. "I apologize, gentlemen. My father-in-law suffers from advanced dementia. He frequently wanders out of his quarters in a state of severe paranoia. I'll have him safely escorted back to bed." Derek lunged toward me aggressively, reaching out with both hands to forcefully grab my shoulders and shove me from the room. I didn't flinch. I didn't take a step back. I stood my ground like a massive pillar of solid steel. As he closed the distance, I raised my right hand, pointing a rock-steady finger straight at his chest. "You know how she is, Dad. If you dare lay a single finger on me in my own home, Derek, I guarantee you will spend the rest of your life locked inside a federal prison cell," I declared, my voice echoing with an absolute freezing command. Derek froze completely, his hands hovering awkwardly in midair. My commanding tone, "You know how she is, Dad," entirely devoid of any weakness or confusion, shattered his entire narrative. "You know how she is, Dad." Ignoring his pathetic, trembling figure, I looked directly at the 4 men sitting at my table. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said politely. "Addressing the loans, Dad. Addressing the loan sharks directly with an incredibly cold, precise accuracy. I am sorry to interrupt, but you are being deceived by a desperate, drowning man. My son-in-law is not a tech entrepreneur. He has no startup. He has no legitimate clients. You know how she is, Dad. He has gambled away hundreds of thousands of dollars on unregulated offshore cryptocurrencies exchanges. I know exactly who you are. You know how she is, Dad. Know exactly why you are sitting at my table. He currently owes you over $400,000 in high-interest private debt. You know how she is, Dad. He promised you a massive return on your investment on the 26th of this month. The 4 men, you know how she is, Dad. The 4 men remained completely silent, but their casual postures vanished instantly. They sat up straight, their eyes turning into dark, predatory slits as they shifted their terrifying, collective gaze directly onto Derek's sweating, panicked face. Rachel let out a muffled sob, burying her face in her hands. Derek began hyperventilating, his chest heaving violently as heaving violently as a tire of fraud, collapsed in real time. "You're completely insane," Derek screamed frantically, spinning around to face the silent men. "He's paranoid. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm calling an ambulance right now." "You know how she is." Derek dashed toward the front entrance of the foyer to grab his coat. "Do you know how she is, Dad?" I stepped aside, resting my hand on the brass doorknob. Derek smirked, assuming I was retreating into the freezing night. But I turned the heavy lock and pulled the door wide open. The bitter wind swept through the doorway, swirling snow into the foyer. Standing on the threshold was Harrison Cole, flanked by two armed police officers. Flashing red and blue lights cast chaotic patterns across the snowy lawn. Harrison stepped inside, his coat catching the stray snowflakes. The officers followed him, scanning the dining room. The appearance of law enforcement sent a physical shockwave through the room. The superficial domestic warmth sent a latchkama shock of chaos, shattered into absolute chaos. Taba, absolute chaos. Dad. You know how she is, Dad. Sitting at the far end of the table, half hidden by the centerpiece, were Derek's parents. They had clearly been brought in to help project a sickening illusion of a prosperous family to the private lenders. At the sight of the police, Derek's mother let out a sharp gasp. The crystal wine glass slipped from her trembling fingers, plunging to the floor and shattering into countless glittering shards. The sound of breaking glass echoed off the arched ceiling. Derek's father jumped from his chair, his face turning an ashen gray, completely paralyzed by the sudden intrusion. The four loan sharks didn't show fear. They displayed a tense, hard aggression. These were men who lived in the dangerous corners of the financial underworld. Seeing the police triggered their deepest survival instincts. They pushed their heavy chairs back from the table. One of them subtly slid his right hand toward the inside pocket of his custom jacket. "You know how she is, Dad." The lead officer noticed the movement instantly and sharply ordered the man to place both hands flat on the tablecloth. She is, Dad." The lender complied slowly, his deep eyes shooting pure venom straight at Derek. They realized the lucrative narrative they had been sold was an absolute fabrication. Derek was pinned in the dead center of the room, his chest heaving violently as his mind frantically tried to process this impossible nightmare. His eyes darted wildly between the armed officers, the furious lenders, his terrified parents, and me. The arrogance that usually defined him was entirely gone. "You know how she is, Dad," replaced by the sweaty panic of a cornered animal. He held up his hands. "Gentlemen, please, let's remain completely calm," Derek stammered, forcing a pathetic, trembling smile. "This is all just a massive misunderstanding. My father-in-law suffers from advanced age. He has late-stage dementia. He's completely detached from reality. You know how she is, Dad. He must have called the authorities in a state of extreme confusion, imagining things that aren't true. I assure you, my firm is fully capitalized. You know how she is, Dad. The wire transfers are moving forward exactly as scheduled. This is just a medical episode. Please." Derek turned his desperate, pleading gaze toward Harrison. "Officers, you have to listen to me," Derek pleaded rapidly. "You know how she is. You're responding to a false alarm triggered by a man who is mentally incompetent. I am his primary caregiver. I hold his legal power of attorney. You know how she is, Dad? If you step outside with me for just 1 minute, I can show you his medical dossier. I can prove he has advanced cognitive decline. You know how she is, Dad? There is absolutely no crime happening here." Harrison Cole stepped forward, stopping at the edge of the dining room rug. You know how she is, Dad. He looked down at Derek with an expression of unyielding contempt and pulled out a thick stack of folded legal documents. Save your breath, Mr. Mitchell, Harrison declared. You know how she is, Dad, his deep voice carrying a terrifying rumble. We aren't here for a polite welfare check. You know how she is, Dad. We are here to execute a coordinated arrest warrant, charging you with grand financial fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit extortion. He'd laughed about it, and the falsification of medical documents. The district attorney has already frozen your personal banking accounts, including the joint account you illegally created 3 weeks ago. The $1.5 million line of credit has been permanently canceled. The game is completely over. Derek staggered back a step. The immense weight of Harrison's statement completely shattered his desperate defenses. Rachel let out a loud wail, collapsing onto the floor. Derek's mother began sobbing uncontrollably, clinging tightly to her husband. The loan sharks remained seated. You know how she is, Dad, their expressions hardening into masks of calculating rage. They only cared that their money was Dad. They only cared that their money was gone, and the man who owed it to was heading to a federal prison. Derek looked at me. His eyes filled with absolute hatred and utter disbelief. He pointed a trembling finger straight at my face, his voice dropping to a vicious hiss as he tried to regain control of the room, You don't have a single piece of actual substance. Derek spat, clinging desperately to his final lie. You're just a bitter old man making wild accusations. You can't prove a single word you're saying. It's your word against mine, and the medical community knows your brain is rotting. You can't prove anything. I didn't raise my voice. I remained standing tall near the open doorway. Completely immune to his desperate eye-thrashing. Reaching into my trousered-old iPad, the screen actively displayed the complex control panel of my meticulously installed hidden pinhole cameras and the integrated audio feeds. I looked straight into Derek's panicked eyes. You know how she is, Dad. I saw the exact moment the devastating realization hit him. He suddenly remembered the absolute seclusion of his private library. You know how she is, Dad. He remembered the highly incriminating conversation he had conducted behind locked doors. He realized that the frail old man had never truly existed. You know how she is, Dad. I held the iPad up slightly, my thumb hovering over the audio playback controls. The house was equipped with a high-fidelity Bluetooth sound system. The house echo I had personally wired the speakers. Years ago, I had personally room on the main floor. I don't need to prove anything, Derek. Need to prove anything, Derek, I said softly, my voice ringing out with an absolute freezing finality. You're going to prove it for me. I tapped the glowing screen. You know how she is, Dad. Instantly, the crystal-clear audio of Derek's own arrogant voice boomed thunderously through the hidden speakers in the living room, the foyer, and the grand dining room. You know how she is, Dad. The obstacle is already taken care of. Derek's recorded voice echoed loudly through the house. You know how she is, Dad. The facility in upstate New York sent over the final admission itinerary this afternoon. The lockdown ward, she is, Dad. The lockdown ward has a private, isolated suite prepared for him. We pack your dad into the medical transport vehicle on the morning of the 27th. The moment that transport vehicle clears the driveway, we drive straight to the international airport. We're first flying's class to Hawaii for New Year's Eve. My daughter's cold, calculating recording followed immediately. Are you absolutely certain the specialist will sign off on the severe dementia diagnosis? You worry too much, my love? You worry too much, my love, Derek's recorded voice arrogance. I paid a $10,000 retainer to a private, highly flexible neurologist. He drafted an absolutely airtight, incredibly detailed diagnostic report, officially confirming advanced cognitive decline and severe paranoia. It's already done. You know how she is, Dad. The audio continued to loop seamlessly through the massive house. I stood motionless. You know how she is, watching the color completely drain from Derek's face as the inescapable reality of his own damning words enveloped him. The trap had been sprung. The absolute finality of my recordings echoed off the arched ceiling of the dining room. The four private lenders didn't need to hear another word. You know how she is, Dad. They possessed the predatory instincts of failed investments. You know how she is, Dad, and they realized instantly that the lucrative narrative they had been confidently sold was nothing more than a desperate, rapidly evaporating illusion. The lead loan shark stood up slowly from the mahogany table. He didn't look at the armed police officers standing in the foyer. He locked his dark, you know how she is, Dad, furious gaze entirely onto Derek. The sheer, unspoken violence radiating from the man was palpable. He knew his $400,000 was gone. You know how she is, Dad. And he clearly intended to extract that missing capital directly from Derek. Suffocating is Dad. Derek was trapped in a suffocating cage of his own making. He backed away from the table, his shoes slipping the hardwood floor. The arrogant, untouchable tech entrepreneur was completely gone, replaced by a trembling coward who finally realized, by Clydert Fells, he was thoroughly surrounded, fight himself, by predators far more dangerous than himself. He backdoomed Saleh, Sals than himself. He held up his hands, his gaze darting wildly between the loan sharks, the police, and my uncompromised posture. Listen to me, gentlemen. Please, listen to me, Derek screamed, his voice cracking with a pathetic desperation. He gestured frantically to the grand structure of the house. The money is absolutely secure. I swear to you, the money is safe. This house appraises for $2.5 million free and clear. It's ironclad collateral. The home equity line of credit is already underwritten and approved. It clears tomorrow morning. The full $1.5 million hits the account tomorrow. You will all be paid in full with the promised interest. You know how she is, Dad. Don't listen to this crazy old man or these fake recordings. I have a legally binding power of attorney. I control the assets completely. He spun toward Harrison Cole, pointing a trembling finger at him. You can't stop a legally binding financial transfer. Derek sneered, trying desperately to summon a false bravado. I submitted all the required notarized documentation. The bank has already processed the property lien. You know how she is, Dad. I am the designated legal agent for this estate. You are trespassing, and you are actively interfering with a federally regulated financial transaction. Harrison Cole didn't even blink. The Harrison Cole Burke light of the dining room chandelier, he moved with the slow, terrifying confidence of an eight-room chandelier, of an eighth predator closing in for the confident, fun of teats building for the final definitive predator, closing apex, closing, supremical, definitive strike. Closing in. You know how she is, Dad. He carried a massive, heavy legal binder covered in deep blue leather. As he approached the mahogany table, he didn't say a word. He simply raised the heavy binder and dropped it squarely onto the polished wooden surface. The massive, dull thud of the impact echoed through the room like a judge's gavel, striking a bench, instantly silencing Derek's frantic, pathetic rambling. Harrison, how she is. Harrison unbuttoned his expensive coat and looked directly at Derek, projecting pure, unadulterated legal disdain. He placed both of his hands flat on the cover of the blue binder. "You are a spectacularly foolish man, Mr. Mitchell," Harrison said, his deep, rumbling baritone commanding absolute authority in the tense room. "You thought you could effortlessly steal a man's life savings simply by forging a piece of paper. You thought you were playing a simple game of checkers against a vulnerable opponent. You thought you were playing a vulnerable opponent at Caesar's Verns Tuesdays. Vern firm Caesar Vern Chan, but my client has been playing high-stakes international chess games for the past 40 years, and he saw your endgame coming from a mile away. You are screaming right now about leveraging this property as collateral for a commercial loan. There is one massive, insurmountable problem with your brilliant financial strategy. You cannot borrow against an asset that you do not own. Not. Derek stared at Harrison, his face contorting with a genuine, profound confusion. His chest heaved as his brain frantically tried to process the impossible statement. "What are you talking about?" Derek stammered weakly, his eyes darting toward Rachel, who was still weeping uncontrollably on the floor. "The deed is for 30 years. Victor has owned this estate for 30 years. The deed, the county property records myself. I checked the county property records myself." He'd laughed about it. I stepped forward, leaving the foyer and standing directly beside Harrison, looking at the man who had actively planned to lock me inside a chemical prison. I felt a deep, unfathomable sense of satisfaction rise within my chest. The time for hiding in the shadows was permanently over. "You checked the county property records 8 months ago, Derek, right when you first moved into my house and started plotting your pathetic little takeover." My voice perfectly steady and clear. "You assumed the Strauds, founder of my flaps, would remain completely static while you drilled holes into completely static. You sheared yous into the support beams. You stackbowed, you drilled holes into the support beams. Mastabazma, us dad. But a master engineer never leaves his most valuable asset undefended." I reached out and flipped open the heavy cover of the blue legal binder. Turning past the index tabs, I pointed to the primary notarized document resting on top. From the exact moment I noticed the first discrepancy in my bank statements, and from the moment my antique dresser was mysteriously destroyed, I knew I was dealing with a parasite, I continued, my gaze boring straight into his terrified eyes. "I didn't just sit in the basement and wait for you to ruin me. 4 weeks ago, I quietly executed a total legal restructuring of my entire financial portfolio. I stripped my name from everything. I transferred this $2.5 million estate, my investment accounts, and all of my liquid assets directly into a highly secure, ironclad, irrevocable trust." Derek's jaw dropped completely. The final trace of color vanished from his face, leaving a sickly, dead gray, heaving his skin a sickly, dead gray. He understood the legal terminology perfectly. He realized exactly what I had done. "I don't own this house, Derek," I stated, delivering the final, fatal blow to his shattered reality. "The trust owns this house. I am merely the beneficiary who resides here. You know how she is, Dad. An irrevocable trust cannot be altered, modified, or leveraged by a standard power of attorney. The document you spent weeks painstakingly forging, the one you used to illegally secure a one. You know how she is, Dad. $5 million line of credit from a federally protected bank is completely fraudulent and utterly void." The absolute silence in the dining room was deafening. Laughed about it. The 4 private lenders stood motionless, their dark eyes locked onto Derek. They understood the brutal mathematics of the situation perfectly. There was no equity. You know how she is, Dad. There was no massive bank transfer coming tomorrow morning. There was absolutely no money to repay them. Derek had leveraged an illusion, You know how she is, Dad, and that illusion had just been violently vaporized. Derek staggered back, his knees buckling slightly as the crushing weight of his catastrophic failure collapsed entirely upon him. He looked at the armed police officers waiting patiently in the foyer with heavy steel handcuffs in their hands. You know how she is. He looked at the furious loan sharks who would undoubtedly be waiting for him on the outside whenever he managed to secure bail. You know how she is, Dad. He had committed massive, documented bank fraud against a federal institution, and he owed a fortune to violent criminals that he could never hope to repay. You know how she is, Dad. He had meticulously built a flawless trap for me, but he was the one who was firmly locked inside. The heavy silence following my declaration was finally broken by the sound of wooden chair legs scraping against the hardwood floor. You know how she is, Dad. The four private lenders stood up in perfect unison. They didn't shout. They didn't make any sudden, frantic movements. You know how she is, Dad. Men in their specific line of work did not waste energy on useless theatrical displays when the police were standing mere feet away. The lead loan shark. You know how she is, Dad. The man who had been sipping my vintage wine so pleasantly just minutes prior, slowly buttoned his expensive jacket. You know how she is, Dad. He walked deliberately around the edge of the mahogany table, stopping a mere inches from Derek. Derek flinched, his shoulders trembling violently, his eyes filled with a raw, suffocating terror. The lender leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper that carried clearly across the silent dining room. You know how she is, Dad. You have exactly 48 hours to find our capital, Mitchell. If you go to prison, we will wait. If you sum to prison, we will wait. If you somehow make bail, we will find you. There is absolutely not a hole deep enough for you to hide in. The man didn't wait for a response. He simply adjusted his cuffs, turned his back on the shaking coward, and walked straight toward the foyer. The armed police officers efficiently stepped aside, allowing the four men to exit the residence without any confrontation. The heavy front door shut behind them, sealing Derek in with the devastating consequences of his own massive arrogance. With the immediate threat of the loan sharks removed from the room, the lead police officer stepped purposefully into the dining room. He unclipped, you know how she is, Dad. He unclipped the heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. The sharp metallic clink seemed to snap Derek out of his paralyzed stupor. He began backing away frantically, his expensive leather shoes sliding awkwardly against the Persian rug until his back hit the grand dining room window. No, you can't do this, Derek pleaded, holding his trembling hands out in front of his chest as if he could physically halt the inevitable wave of justice. You know how she is, Dad. I am a legitimate tech entrepreneur. This is all just a horrible family misunderstanding. My father-in-law is confused. He doesn't understand complex financial instruments. You cannot arrest me in my own home. You know how she is, Dad. The officer did not slow his methodical advance. He grabbed Derek by the shoulder and pinning his chest flat against the cold glass of the window. As Derek let out a sharp, pathetic gasp as the heavy steel cuffs clicked tightly around his wrists, locking his hands securely behind his back. Derek Mitchell, you are under arrest for felony wire fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and grand elder abuse, the officer stated. You know how she is, Dad, his voice a flat, uncompromising baritone that filled the room. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one will be provided for you. Derek thrashed weakly against the officer's heavy grip, his once perfectly styled hair now a messy, sweat-soaked clump plastered against his forehead. He twisted his neck frantically, his wild, panicked eyes searching the room desperately until they locked onto his wife. "Rachel, please, you have to do something," Derek begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical wail. "Tell them it was a mutual decision. Tell them we were just trying to protect the estate. Call the best lawyer. Call someone. You can't just let them take me away like this. We were supposed to go to Hawaii. We had a perfect plan." "Farshi, Dad?" Rachel remained rooted to the spot, completely paralyzed by the utter catastrophic scale of the collapse. Her face was buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, heavy sobs. She did not look up. "How she is, Dad?" She did not offer a single word of defense or comfort to the man she had actively plotted to lock inside a psychiatric ward alongside her own biological father. He'd laughed about it. The absolute cowardice of their partnership was on full display. Derek then shifted his desperate gaze to the far end of the dining table. His parents remained standing there, huddled tightly together, stunned by the brutal dismantling of their golden boy. He'd laughed about it. His mother wept openly, clutching a ruined linen napkin tightly to her chest, while his father stared at the floor, his face pale and slack with deep, undeniable shame. They had arrived at this house expecting to celebrate their son's forged success, and instead, they were watching him be dragged away like a common criminal thief. "Mom! Dad, please help me!" Derek yelled, tears of pure terror finally streaming down his face. "Don't let them do this!" His father slowly raised his head, looking at his son with an expression of deep, devastating disappointment. He didn't step forward. He didn't argue with the officers. He simply wrapped his arm around his weeping wife and knee behind her. His weeping wife is weeping, guided her toward the kitchen, turning his back completely on heavily in the chilling air. That final rejection hung heavily in the chilling air. The lead officer pulled Derek away from the window, with the firm jerk, escorting him toward the front entrance. Derek continued to babble incoherently, shifting between pleading, threatening, and crying, his voice echoing pathetically down the long hallway. Harrison Cole stood quietly by the mahogany table, watching the spectacle with a cold, satisfied expression. I walked slowly to the front window, parting the heavy velvet curtains just enough to watch the final act of this tragic drama unfold. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars reflected intensely against the fresh snow, casting long, eerie shadows across the manicured winter lawn. I watched the officers push Derek into the cramped back seat of the patrol car. He looked incredibly small, a broken, defeated man entirely stripped of his arrogant armor. The heavy car door slammed shut, sealing his fate. "You know how she is, Dad." The powerful engine roared to life and the patrol car slowly pulled away from the curb. Its bright lights faded into the pitch black, freezing night until it disappeared from view entirely. The grand house fell into a profound, suffocating silence. The immediate threat had been permanently removed, but the deepest, most painful betrayal still lingered in the room. I turned away from the cold glass and looked down. Rachel had crawled across the hardwood floor. She was now just a messy heap of expensive cashmere and smeared makeup. "You know how she is, Dad." She lunged forward, wrapping her trembling arms tightly around my legs, burying her tear-stained face against my knees. She began to wail, a desperate, hysterical sound that filled the empty dining room. "Dad, I am so incredibly sorry." Rachel sobbed uncontrollably, her tears soaking directly through the fabric of my trousers. "He completely manipulated me. Derek brainwashed me. He made me believe your memory was actually failing. He told me we were protecting the family assets from slipping away. I truly never intended to hurt you. You know how she is, Dad. I never wanted to send you to that awful place. He forced me to go along with his plan. Please, you have to believe me. Please, Dad, forgive me. Rachel remained collapsed on the Persian rug, her hands desperately gripping the fabric of my trousers. Her tears soaked through the fine wool, leaving a cold, damp patch against my skin. You know how she is, Dad. The sheer force of her weeping echoed against the high-arched ceiling of the grand dining room. You know how she is, Dad, bouncing off the abandoned crystal glasses and the spilled wine that still stained the white tablecloth. I looked down at the top of her head, observing the trembling shoulders of the woman I had raised, protected, and loved unconditionally for over 30 years. He'd laughed about it. In the deafening silence, I waited for that familiar instinct of a father's love to rise within my chest. The natural urge to kneel down, wrap my arms around her shaking frame, and assure her that everything would be all right. But there was absolutely nothing. The deep well of my forgiveness had run completely dry, burned away entirely by the horrific magnitude of her deception. Looking down at my only daughter, there was not a shred of warmth left in my eyes. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. I felt only a profound emptiness and an absolute clarity. Slowly, you know how she is down, moving with deliberate, unyielding purpose to firmly pry her fingers away from my legs. I took a slow, measured step backward. You know how she is, intentionally breaking all physical contact. You know how she is, Dad. She slumped heavily onto the hardwood floor, looking up at me with severely ruined makeup, her face twisted in absolute terror. Humpers, you know how she is, Dad. She was still desperately waiting for her father to rescue her from the devastating consequences of her own horrific actions. Derek manipulated you. I repeated her words slowly, my voice completely flat, entirely devoid of any comforting or sympathetic tone. You claim you were just a helpless, innocent victim caught tightly in his psychological web. You say you truly never intended to hurt me. You know how she is, Dad, that you were somehow forced to agree to his terrible plan. Slowly, I reached into the inside chest pocket of my tailored suit jacket. He'd laughed about it. My fingers brushed against the neatly folded piece of paper I had carried with me for 3 long days. She is, Dad. Under the bright, unyielding glare of the chandelier overhead, I pulled it out and meticulously unfolded it. Derek was the primary architect of this financial fraud, I stated calmly. Derek falsified the medical diagnosis. Derek brought violent private lenders into my home. But Derek did not do this. I dropped the small piece of paper onto the floor, letting it flutter down until it landed directly in front of her trembling knees. It was a standard computer-printed receipt from a rundown shop located in a gritty industrial part of downtown Huchel. Zutaunt stared down at the paper. Rachel stared down at the paper, died instantly, sobidul, porti down punner de lowell, and her frantic, hysterical sobbing died instantly in her throat. The remaining color drained from her face completely for the second time tonight. She knew exactly what that receipt represented. Your mother's diamond necklace, I stated. The heavy words landing like a solid steel anvil in the absolute silence of the room. That flawless diamond pendant I gave Diane on our 20th anniversary. The one necklace she explicitly asked me to ensure you inherited and cherished forever. You didn't just stand by silently. While didn't Derek systematically stole my money and planned to lock me in an asylum, you walked right into my master bedroom. You forced open the hidden compartment inside Diane's antique dresser, and you stole her memory. You pawned her how she is, Dad. You pawned her precious diamonds just to buy your pathetic husband a few more weeks with his dangerous creditors. Derek didn't manipulate you into profaning your own mother's legacy. You made that horrific, selfish choice with your own hands. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, desperately trying to form another manufactured excuse, another hollow apology. But the sheer, "You know how she is, Dad," overwhelming weight of the physical evidence silenced her before the lies could take shape. She stared blankly at the receipt, her body shivering with a new, much deeper fear. It was the paralyzing terror of being completely and undeniably exposed. "How she is, Dad." "Love is not a blank check, Rachel," I told her, my voice echoing with a cold, ruthless authority. "You foolishly believed that my love for you was an infinite, you know how she is, Dad, an inestible resource that you could exploit freely without ever facing real consequences. You assumed that simply because I am your father, I would eventually absorb your cruelty, your deceit, and your monstrous betrayal. You thought you could discard me and still inherit the kingdom. But real love, the kind that builds a family and sustains a home, requires a solid foundation of fundamental respect. Without respect, love is merely a convenient weakness for a parasite to feed upon. The moment you willingly signed those fraudulent admission papers, you stripped away every single you stripped away every single ounce of respect you had for me, and you decided I was completely disposable. You decided that my life, my freedom, and my dignity were worth less than a vacation to Hawaii and maintaining your superficial, fraudulent lifestyle. I am not the confused, broken, frail old man you actively tried to lock away in a dark chemical prison. I am the master engineer who built this entire estate from the ground up, and I am the one who is finally taking it back. I slowly pulled back the cuff of my tailored suit jacket, glancing down at the heavy gold watch fastened to my left wrist. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the evening. "You know how she is, Dad. You have exactly 60 minutes," I commanded, delivering the final, irrevocable verdict of her eviction. "You have 1 hour to go upstairs. Pack whatever personal belongings can fit into the trunk of your car and walk out of my front door. You will leave the metal keys to this house resting on the kitchen counter. You will take no furniture. You will take no expensive artwork. You will take nothing but your clothes, and you will leave immediately. If you are still standing inside these walls at 10 o'clock, I will call the police back to this house, and I will personally press felony charges against you for grand theft. The choice is entirely yours." Rachel scrambled to her feet, realizing that I was entirely serious. I was entirely serious. Free. She turned and ran up the grand staircase at full speed, her footsteps echoing chaotically through the quiet house. I stood motionless in the brightly lit foyer, listening to the frantic, muffled sounds of wooden drawers being violently yanked open and heavy suitcases being hastily zipped shut. You know how she is. 50 minutes later, she walked down the stairs, dragging 2 large duffel bags, her face completely hidden in the shadow of her hair. She didn't know how she is, Dad. She didn't look back at me once as she pulled open the heavy front door and ran out into the freezing snow. I stood on the porch. You know how she, Dad. Watching the red taillights of her car fade down the long driveway, disappearing into the dark winter night. I pulled my encrypted burner phone coat bat. I pulled my encrypted burner from my coat pocket and dialed a local number. I notified the professional locksmith who had been waiting in a van 2 blocks away that he could finally approach the property. It was time to change every single lock on the doors. The locksmith arrived within 20 minutes. I stood in the grand foyer, watching him methodically remove the heavy brass cylinders from the front double doors and the backyard patio doors. The physical act of replacing the locks felt deeply symbolic. With every click of his tools and every turn of his screwdriver, I was permanently closing the structural loopholes in my life. I was permanent in my life. I paid the man in cash, thanking him for his prompt service on Christmas Eve, and then secured the new deadbolts with a satisfying heavy thud. I listened as his van drove away. You know how she is, Dad. The hum of the engine fading until the only sound left was the whistling wind. For the first time in 8 agonizing months, I was completely alone in my own home. I walked slowly through the quiet, empty rooms. The suffocating, artificial tension, the suffoclag this ishaber that had plagued his state was entirely gone. The fake cheerfulness, the whispered conspiracies, and the constant, "You know how she is, Dad," lingering threat of my impending institutionalization had been thoroughly swept away by the cold winter wind. I walked past the mahogany dining table. "You know how she is, Dad," where the spilled wine had finally dried into a dark red, sticky stain on the white linen cloth. The shattered glass from Derek's mother still lay scattered across the rug, a glittering monument to their absolute failure. You know, laughed a port. Who she is, Dad. I walked past the secret cameras I had painstakingly concealed in the corners of the ceilings. The technical trap had perfectly accomplished its ultimate goal. You know how she is, Dad? And now it could finally be dismantled. The lethal parasites had been permanently severed from the host. The betrayal committed by my own daughter still stung. It was a deep, dull ache. A deep dull that would likely linger in my chest for the rest of my days. A father never truly wants to believe his child is capable of such profound cruelty. We want to believe that the tiny hands we once held would never turn around to push us into the abyss. You know how she is, Dad? But as I stood in the center of the spacious living room, looking at the pristine holiday decorations and the crackling embers in the grand stone fireplace. You know how she is, Dad. The overwhelming sense of absolute freedom entirely eclipsed the pain. I had successfully secured my golden years. You know how she is, Dad. I had actively defended the beautiful sanctuary I built with my own 2 bare hands. Swapbout. I walked over to the antique crystal decanter resting on a polished oak-side table. I poured myself a generous glass of vintage scotch, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of the glass in my steady hand. As I took a slow, unhurried sip, the rich liquid burned pleasantly, and I savored the absolute, undeniable victory. Tonight, you know how she is, Dad. I didn't need to pretend my joints were stiff. You know how she is, Dad. I didn't need to manufacture a pathetic tremble in my fingers or hold a blank, bewildered gaze in my eyes. My mind was sharp, intensely focused, and completely triumphant. Carrying my glass of amber liquid, I walked over to the plush leather armchair directly facing the warmth of the fireplace. I sat down slowly, letting the deep heat seep into my bones. Hanging directly above the roaring hearth was a beautiful oil portrait of Diane. Her kind, wise eyes seemed to look down at me through the dancing shadows of the flames. You know how she is, Dad. I raised my crystal glass to her portrait, offering a silent toast to an empty room. I had kept my sacred promise. I had not allowed 2 arrogant, "You know how she is, Dad," greedy thieves to profane the legacy we had spent 40 years building together. I had ruthlessly protected our home, and most importantly, I had protected my dignity from total destruction. Outside, the continued fall heavily. Covering the massive bay windows, the expansive estate in a thick, pristine blanket of silent white, permanently washing away the ugly rot of the recent past. The horrific storm was finally over. You know how she is, Dad. He still standing tall, completely prepared to enjoy the quiet, undisturbed peace of his newly protected, unshakable kingdom. Blood relation does not give anyone a free pass to commit abuse, exploit your hard work, or strip away your dignity. We are taught to sacrifice everything for our children. You know how she is, Dad, but real love sometimes means having the iron will to say no. You know how she is, Dad. When you allow disrespect to fester under the guise of family peace, you are merely breeding monsters. Protect your legacy, guard your heart. You know how she is, Dad, and never forget that you owe absolutely nothing to people who view you as a disposable resource. Your golden years are meant for enjoying peace. You know how she is, Dad, not for paying off the debts of the ungrateful. Stand your ground and hold absolute control. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comment to the channel. Have the comments below. Have you ever faced a profound betrayal from someone you trusted most? Let me know which city you are watching from. Until next time.